Greetings, it's Silas here. I'm here with Steven. You can say what's up.
Hello, everyone.
We're here for our conversation series, and I think with this conversation, Steven's going to tell us a bit about it. But I think this is for the people who are kind of interested in understanding more about the roots, the base information and content of some of the major things that are happening in the wokosphere. I don't know what to call it, but it's in the United States of America, social-political atmosphere area. The terms of the actual defining what it is, because this is kind of intricate. But Stephen, just tell us a bit about what we're reading, and then maybe I'll think of a better way of putting it.
Sure. So
And then maybe I'll think of a better way of putting it.
Sure. So we're going over an essay on, it's called an essay on liberation. It was written by Herbert Marcuse in 1969. If you saw our other videos, Silas did a reading, and then we did a discussion on his essay, Repressive Tolerance, written in 1965. He was a very prominent Marxist philosopher. He's been called the father of the new left in the United States. He spoke at Vietnam protests, anti-Israel protests. He was a mentor to Angela Davis. And if you go through his writings, you can see a lot of themes that are definitely relevant to today. Now, he's one of those that he's not as well known among the general populace. And if you ask the average social justice warrior, they probably won't cite him directly, but you can definitely see that he's had an impact. And again, going through his works, as we've done and we're going to continue to do, you'll see a lot of themes that are definitely very familiar.
Yeah, I would say this is for people who want to understand some of the things that are going on a more academic point, because at this point, Marcuse was just thinking about ideas and he wasn't really applying many of these things. Now, people have taken some of the ideas that he crystallized and put together and have now applied it in different ways that we're seeing acting out in society. And I think one of the main things we're seeing is some of the ideas that he points out seems to be realistic and fit, especially trying to imagine the information that he had at the time, looking at his background, having escaped Germany right before Hitler came to power, going to Switzerland, came to the United States of America. The amount of access to information you had at that time, the observations that he was making seemed to be accurate, but then people are taking that as is at that time and trying to apply it in current timeline. And it's like, okay, we're living in a very different world. And some of the things Marcuse was pointing out, we found out might not have been quite accurate or were completely wrong in some cases, but people don't really seem to be taking those steps to adjust. So it's kind of like, this is more like the Dead Sea Scrolls the Dead Sea Scrolls were initial writings and stuff like that. Then some other people took those and then they wrote the Bible based off of some of the things that are in there, and some other things were brought in and things like that. And then you can look at that and then you wouldn't have the Bible without the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think, in general. So you wouldn't have some of the things like critical without the content Marcuse wrote here. But then just like with how there's a lot of people who believe in Christianity, very few of them have read the Bible. Much fewer have read the Dead Sea Scrolls, because a lot of people are involved in things with critical theory, living in a world and systems influenced by critical theory, that have never even read the Bible or don't even realize those things come from critical theory, from those actual content, from the actual school of thought. We did an entire series with cynical theories, which was James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, was it? Who had written a book studying it, and we did a breakdown of that. I really enjoyed that conversation. We're enjoying all these conversations. But so that content, people haven't gone to that point, let alone going back with Repressive Tolerance, with Herbert Marcuse. And if they have touched Marcuse, it's normally Repressive Tolerance. And then in our last conversation that Stephen and I thought, okay, let's actually check and see what else is out there. And those are the kind of people that I think this content is for. It's probably a very small set of people who are trying to understand the things that seem inane and crazy going on, that now those things, you don't have to agree with the things going on, but by hearing and listening to these things, it makes me, oh, that's why they're saying this. Oh, I can see. And it just helps me make sense of some of the seemingly nonsensical things that are going on in the world. Yeah.
And as I mentioned last time, too, we want to read this directly because we want to show that we've actually engaged the material and that we understand it. We're not creating a caricature and then making fun of the caricature. As people who talk to me know, I frequently criticize the lefty comedians for this. It's either clips edited out of context, and it's clips of the least informed members of an opposing audience just mocked and made fun of. I don't want to do that here. I want to show, okay, we're reading these people directly. We're reading Angela Davis's mentor. Here's what he wrote, and then here's our thoughts on it. I'm not just imagining him saying this. This is the essay itself.
Yeah. And this comes from the point of view because we're not characterizing these people as just evil people. Some of the things they do might end up harming a lot of people, and that's one thing I think it does. Yeah. And to counter that, instead of just saying, "Oh, you're doing wrong," I'd like to see if there's ways I can understand what doing, learn the kind of language and point of view, and try to be able to relate more to where they're coming from, and then see if I can find the places in there where it's like, oh, I can see where they went wrong. Then maybe if I'm listening to that content, or if I'm engaging the few people in that sphere that are willing to actually engage on this, can be like, oh, did you hear about this part? Maybe that's the thing that you went wrong on, and maybe you might change my mind. Maybe there's stuff in here, I might come out of this just being a critical theorist. I doubt it, but I mean, I'm open to getting the information. And I think I think in general, there's a bell curve of people who are willing to actually engage on things that they feel strongly about. And even within the critical theory sphere and those kind of places, there's going to be people who are willing to actually talk and imagine that. Because some of the things they're talking about now are some of the things I used to kind of believe before I actually looked into the actual thing, because I was accepting their premises and some of their flawed data that they were basing some of these things on. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, too. I don't know if you saw my exchange with my friend Edward, but it was on the James Lindsay video with Benjamin Boyce. And in the comments we discussed, because I was a Catholic, he was a Mormon, both turned atheist, and we talked about like our sort of turning away from religion and what caused all this and everything. And James Lindsay brought up in the discussion, there was something about the religious people call it a God-shaped hole in the heart or something. Yeah. And it's the idea that, oh, what's lacking in these people's lives is religion. They need it. And then what James Lindsay was saying, that this has actually been studied further in depth, and they've tried to figure out, why do certain people gravitate towards religion, others don't seem to? Like, for example, with us, I mean, we talk about the different types of atheists. Like, there are people who will go on and on about how superstitious and irrational Christianity is, but then they'll adhere to everything that Marx said and not question it. There are objectivists like this too, that like I've been influenced by Ayn Rand, but there are people who will take everything she said as gospel and not question it. So there's the theory that certain people are drawn towards this religious thinking. Now, there's different theories about why. Now, Edward wondered if it's more of a group thing, like people want to feel solidarity with the group, like, oh, I'm part of a group, I have a sense of belonging, there's safety in numbers, all that. With other people, I wonder, is it a lack of confidence? Is it they don't trust their own reason and ability to understand the world, so it's easier just to defer to other people and let other people make the decisions? I think it could be a bit of both. I think it depends on the person in the case. And I guess this is what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, the idea that, oh, all these people are following a religion, they themselves haven't read the Bible, like your bell curve example. Like there's people on the far right of the bell curve who've read everything in the Bible, can repeat it back to you from memory, know it well. There's people on the left who will say, I haven't read it, I just follow my family, and most people are somewhere in between. I think that collective unconscious is largely in between. It's well, millions of people are saying this, must be right, why should I do my own research and listen? And again, that could be lack of confidence and reason. It could be some innate intelligence. It could be, the whole safety in numbers. It could be some combination of the things, but I think it's a very interesting theme. And I wonder, as that gets further explored, what will come up.
Yeah. I mean, because where does this come from? And I think we touched on this a bit in the last conversation, was how when a being comes to be, when a sentient being comes to be, it's existed with humans. We normally exist as babies in the world, engaging with things. Of course, when you're in the womb, you have some sort of awareness of the location that you're in. And in the womb, even if you did become aware, you would be aware that you are not a single being. Like, you are a being that is relying on another being for existence. Then you come out from that, you're separated from that being. Again, I don't know how the memory works at that point. I don't think you're completely conscious or even writing that stuff down. But it comes to a point when a baby starts realizing that, these things that they were aware of, hand movements. Sometimes a baby will just freeze up and just like all of a sudden just disconnect, just stare at their hand. It's like, wait, this thing was here before. Like, I recognize that thing from somewhere. Like, I've seen this thing before. So all of a sudden you start realizing, like, all these things around you, these senses, are in part that I thought were just one thing. It's me. This is me, and that is somebody else. That's mom. That's my my dad, that's my sister, that's the building I'm in, that's the carpet, that's the sky. You start realizing that I'm an individual within a collective. And I
Yeah.
think you start trying to figure out how are you parts of different collectives. Like, so I think that could come to the thing where it's like the individualism versus the collectivism. I think that's one of the basic type of things where things either lean individualist or collectivist. In general, how everything we look at in the world goes towards those things. Is this a single thing, or is this a single experience, or is this a group of things? This is a group of experiences. And I think it's trying to find your place as an individual in different groups. And that's an entire structure, as you were mentioning. And I don't necessarily think it's a God-shaped hole. It's more like a misunderstanding shaped hole, or like an unknown, like a known unknown shaped hole. And then we normally fit God in there. And then there's some
Well,
other. Go
what I
ahead.
wonder is is it a holdover? It's an evolutionary psychology thing. It's a holdover from earlier times where if you go far back in our history, man didn't understand the world. So of course that's where religion came from, but also you had to stick with a group of people because that's how you survived. And that we're not at a point where the world is so individuated yet where that's evolved out of us. It's some certain people may fall back on that. Now, I've mentioned before about how they wonder if Asperger's, high functioning autism is the next form of evolution. The more individualism, logical, considered, some people would argue logical to a fault. I obviously reject that premise, but you get the idea. But they've wondered, like, is it that we're going more towards individualism, more in that direction because we're not in that world of, okay, we don't understand the world. We need religion to explain things, and we need to stick with our tribe or we're going to get killed. Because we've been shifting away from that over time, that's sort of gradually evolving out of us. It's just a question of who still has those instincts and who doesn't, but we're gradually moving away from that. That's kind of my take on it. But
Yeah, and I think that also comes with, because humans were humans for a long time. This whole idea that people are like, oh, religion's been with us since humanity began. No, not at all.
no.
We are sentient beings, animals that were different, very differentiated from the rest of the animal kingdom, the rest of the earthlings, for millennia. I think for at least thousands of years before the first tribes started developing religions, like those first sculptures. They probably had religions before they were sculpting things like that. Quasi religions or proto religions. But that whole idea, no, you can't exist without that, without it being a religious thing. And I think that's, as we got more developed, we started interacting with topics and things that we knew existed, but we were so beyond our ability to actually understand that once we got to actually having known unknowns, where we know it rains for some reasons, but we have no clue why those reasons occur. But then there's this massive set of things that we know wouldn't occur unless we acted on it. So at that point in time, we're like, okay, so this other stuff probably has, just like we know that we can create actions that don't quote unquote naturally occur unless we act on them, then the basic normal state of existence is not raining. So when it rains, which is different from the norm, we think, okay, that's something has happened to change that other thing. And then somebody might have been like, oh, that's how we kind of developed this whole idea of now who is the being, who is the creature, who is the thing that's actually creating that in some different way. So I don't know if that's some of that.
But
Yeah.
I just point this out with the Marxists and similar types because it's like they go on and on about how superstitious and irrational religion, especially Christianity, is, but then they'll dogmatically follow all this stuff without question. And they also don't, you can read Murray Rothbard's Marx as a religious eschatologist. They don't see all the religious themes in the writing itself. And if you read Marx's earlier stuff, there's a lot of fire and brimstone, the world is ending. And Marx even Marx even wanted to be a poet earlier on. They talked about he wanted to be the next Faust. So he was way more of a romantic than people think, despite his so-called hard-nosed scientific socialism.
Look at all these data points. Marx, and
Yeah.
then I'm not saying Marx is exactly the same as Hitler or anything, but we have these failed artists who went on to do certain social political things. So I think the thing to do right now is like you can go down below and hit the link to my to my merchandise store and support some of my art designs, because you need to go out there and find an artist and support them and make sure they actually stick being an artist instead of entering politics, because it doesn't really seem to lead to good results. But yeah,
Oh man.
the whole thing I was talking with the unknown thing, that's a similar thing with the Marxists. It's a similar thing with the communists. Like I saw this one tweet, somebody was it was posted this. It said like that picture of the Evergreen. So the Ever, I think it's Evergreen ship. I don't know. There's another
Yeah.
name, the actual ship, but it's the Evergreen company that was stuck in the Suez Canal and has been unlodged, I think, earlier today.
Yeah.
Um, there was that popular picture that was making a lot of memes with the ship over there, and then a digger like on the side trying to dig it out there.
Yeah.
And then people are like, someone's like, oh, talking about raising the minimum wage, and then now like the entire world economy, or this massive part of the world economy is like it's depending on this unskilled labor. And then so, it's like, who thinks somebody driving a digger is unskilled labor? Like that is skilled labor. So like these people just don't understand economics. So that's the kind of thing for them. They don't really, they know enough about the world economics. They know that if they have this thing, it's coming from somewhere else. Like someone's like, oh, there's going to be a toilet paper shortage. And someone's like, ah, there's no way the United States of America doesn't make toilet paper locally. I'm like, they could make it locally, but they're getting the wood pulp from somewhere. I mean, they're
Yeah.
going to get some other parts, maybe even just the glue that's it, or the plastic that covers it. There's other things. It's not just like, oh, everything's in one location.
No.
So people are aware of a global economy. They're aware of a globalized world, but they don't necessarily understand how some of these things will work. They have phones and they realize they don't know any one person in their world, in their life, that could have made the entire phone. So they
No.
understand they must be these massive markets and industries of moving pieces for you to get the thing. Like that really good story on fee.com of the pencil, of how different parts come
iPencil,
to
yeah.
make a pencil. They understand, they are aware of that, but they don't understand it. So they just insert that kind of religious idea of socialism, where if I need something, we need to create a system where I get it, where I don't really have to, I shouldn't really have to do much to just get the thing, because there's so many things out there and they don't understand that thing. And I think that's how they get to some of these ideas. People understand there's injustice. Oh, we don't really understand how this injustice happens. So critical theory, there's this oppressive stack type of thing. It's just, it's a mess. And in my experience, people have been trying to understand these things, and this is part of the process of Stephen and I trying to understand these things, and that's why we engage in these conversations and get the time to actually read and have these conversations and share them with you guys, gals, and everything else in between that are listening. Yeah.
Well, I watched a documentary last night on Mao, and it was about the Great Leap Forward, and they were talking about how China was 90% agricultural, and he wanted to surpass the United Kingdom steel production in 15 years. And that's where you hear all these crazy ideas of, well, he wanted to produce all this food, export a lot of it to buy modern factories, but he also wanted to have these farmers produce steel. And that's where this whole backyard furnace idea came from. Now, again, I don't know much about making steel, but it's not something anyone can just do on the fly. It's not lighting a campfire in your backyard. So he said, what did he say? Farmers have to have to walk with both feet. What he meant was 1 foot in agriculture, 1 foot in industry. So he's like, well, why don't we build all these backyard furnaces out of them, produce steel? Well, one, the steel they produced was terrible quality, couldn't be used. And then there were also issues with the crops, because there was the whole thing about, he thought sparrows were eating the seed. So he had people kill sparrows, but then in turn, bugs started reproducing like crazy and then eating crops. And they estimate, I mean, 50 million Chinese starved to death. And this was all because this harebrained idea of, oh, I can force a country to leap forward economically from 90% farming to a modern economy in a decade and a half. And what's really messed up too is, apparently he said in a Politburo meeting, I'd be willing to see half my people starved. I'd be willing to see half my people die to feed the other half. Like, can you imagine if any U.S. leader said that? As like, yeah. Yeah.
I think those are some of the things that we know now that Marcuse didn't know. I don't think that was known during Marcuse's time. When he was writing this was 1969, he said. So this is
Yeah,
just
I mean, he knew about the atrocities in the Soviet Union, and he did criticize them in fairness. But it's still my criticism of him. It's still that magical thinking of, oh well, somehow under my system these things wouldn't happen. But also, I want socialism without bureaucracy. It's like, how is this going to work? I mean,
yeah.
uh,
Heavy stuff. Okay, so you want to get into the reading now?
yeah, we can jump right in.
Okay, so the way we're going to be doing this is Stephen has read through this and he's taking different excerpts. He's going to read excerpts from the essay. There's going to be a link below to that essay so you can read along with us or read ahead if you haven't read it before, or pick different other parts. There might be other parts that you say, oh, well, how come you didn't go over this? Let us know in the comment section, and maybe we'll talk about that, or maybe not. I don't know. Take a chance. So we've done the intro. We've done part 1. And now we're in part 2, this second section, the new sensibility, and there's going to be 2 more parts, and I think we'll do each part in a separate video. Yeah.
So this section, I skipped around a little bit for those who read the whole essay because it delves a bit deeper into things about Kant and aesthetics and what is the philosophy of aesthetics. I didn't want to skip the whole thing because some of it is useful. I'll get into this about how this sort of dealt with culture and the idea of sort of like the so-called black culture rebelling against a dominant culture. And some of this is valuable, but at the same time, some of the really heavily philosophical stuff, like there's someone like you who's an artist, it may be interesting, but how it relates to the current woke people, I don't think it's as relevant, so I didn't feel the need to emphasize it as much. All right, so jump right in here. The the new sensibility. The new sensibility has become a political factor. This event, which may well indicate a turning point in the evolution of contemporary societies, demands that critical theory incorporate the new dimensions into its concept. Its concepts project its implications for the possible construction of a free society. Such a society presupposes throughout the achievements of the existing societies, especially their scientific and technical achievements. Released from their service in the cause of exploitation, they could be mobilized for the global elimination of poverty and toil. True, this redirection of the intellectual and material production already presupposes the revolution in the capitalist world. The theoretical projection seems to be fatally premature, were it not for the fact that the awareness of the transcendent possibilities of freedom must become a driving power in the consciousness and the imagination which prepare the soil for this revolution. The latter will be essentially different and effective precisely to the degree to which it is carried forward by this power. All right. Thoughts and comments?
Okay. Here he says, such a society presupposes throughout the achievements of existing societies, especially their scientific and technical achievements, released from their service in the cause of exploitation, they could be mobilized in the global elimination of poverty and toil. Now, this is what I was trying to see. What would he think about the change between 1969 when he's writing this to now, when we're living more in a machine labor world, as Alex Epstein says, and we've had the quality of life of the average person in the first world is exponentially higher than it was back then, let alone like 100 years before that, due to technology. Now, I wonder if he would still buy into that whole idea, like some current critical theorists say, where they say, oh, this is due to exploitation. But and then again, exploitation has a negative connotation, but I think in general, it's not a negative term. Like you exploit things, like what do you consider if you actually have a tree and you plant you have some land and you plant that land to grow trees, and then you take all the fruit from those trees and you replant some, is that exploitation? Is it what would he define as exploitation versus just economization or a regular usage? Like what kind of usage are the things, and would he say like the advancements that have occurred are in spite of exploitation or due to exploitation, or would he say we've actually done some things that are what he was talking about here, that if you actually change this, because you look at the poverty level, the floor, remains the floor, very few people are truly at the floor anymore. Like you look at the global poverty level, I don't think it's anymore called the dollar a day, even with inflation. I think it's changed now to something like $5 a day, because it's been eliminated so much across the world, even in places like China, with them kind of adding, it's more like a neo-fascist place right now, but they still broke in some aspects of capitalism after the Great Leap Forward with Mao Zedong and things like that. Just we're talking about this. It's just like just thinking about that many.
Well, I would say, I mean, to be more precise, I would say it was after the Cultural Revolution and Mao's death where the leaders sort of realized what we're doing is not working. So they sort of gradually rediscovered capitalism. And Yaron Brook has a good explanation for this, how they decided like, okay, this collectivized farming is leading to starvation and shortages. So let's privatize a plot of land, see how it does. It does well. Okay, let's privatize another plot. That did well. And then they keep doing it. Eventually, it's like you've rediscovered capitalism. And I forget the leader who took over after Mao. I mean, brutal guy. I mean, he was responsible for Tiananmen Square and all that, but he was a bit of a pragmatist. And he said, look, what we're doing is not working. Let's try something else. Let's open to foreign investment. And then they sort of walk that line of, okay, we're somewhat capitalist. You can become rich. You can invest here if you're a foreigner, but at the same time, you're still under the thumb of the party. So, but I think they were smart enough to see, okay, what we're doing is not working. But because Mao was so scary and kept such a firm grip, even as an doddering old man with his health failing, people wouldn't go against him because they were scared. But when he died, it's okay, let's try something else and see what works.
Yeah, they still had some. I think it's better to say instead of rediscovering capitalism, they rediscovered some capitalist practices because it's
Yeah,
definitely
yeah,
when they say capitalism, that's like the whole hog, I think. But no, that
yeah.
definitely was not adopted. But yeah, so yeah, I wonder what Marcuse would say because it seems a lot of the people who follow critical theory and follow some of these things when it comes to econ, when it comes to some of the people who are socialists and things like that, will say like, oh no, all these advancements, they hardly ever actually admit that we actually are a lot better off in general. If you listen to this, chances are you live in a society that was a lot better off than if you just lived in that same exact location and moved back to 1969 when Marcuse was writing this. Some people might say no because it's the 70s and depending on where you're living, some people might prefer that. But personally, for me, living in Nairobi, Kenya, I'm like, no, Kenya was a lot worse in 1970 than it is now here. Like, so yeah.
Well, if you ever read Critical Theory by Horkheimer, this actually sounds a lot like it, where he talks early on, he opens up talking about science and the advancement and how it's benefited people, but then he talks about it almost reminds me a bit of what Thomas Kuhn wrote, if you're familiar, the idea of that science advances in paradigms and that the status quo seeks to preserve the existing paradigm, and then it's allowed to progress when they decide the old paradigm it's either obsolete or they'll benefit from the changes. So like the example I always bring up is the pterocentric versus heliocentric view of the world, on physics and Newtonian versus Einsteinian. Like the knowledge was there, it's just a lot of the people in charge weren't willing to accept the new changes because there's too many people invested in the current status quo. And then when the people in power both start to die off and things change and they realize we do benefit from the new school of thought, let's adapt it. So I am like somewhat sympathetic to that, but I think what it is people have butchered Kuhn's argument and said, oh well, because of this, science is just socially constructed, when it's no, we can arrive at existing truths. It's just there are people in the current system who benefit from things being a certain way, so they're going to resist the changes. But it doesn't mean the truth itself has changed in accordance with each era. It's just a question of who's allowing who to speak and put out their information. So,
Yeah. I mean, what's true is true, but I
yeah.
think things that are true are different than what's accepted as truths. And I, because there's some things like truths are based off of some certain things. Like, I think there's like if you're reading Spider-Man, there's certain truths in Spider-Man. Like Spider-Man in accepting the universe of Spider-Man, it's a truth that Uncle Ben was killed and said, "With great power comes great respect," and Spider-Man got his powers by being bitten by a radioactive spider. That isn't true because it's something that's in a fictional world, but it's a truth in that world. If that kind of makes any sense, I think. I don't
Hmm.
know.
But
Maybe that's being too into semantics and maybe I'm making that up. But I think there is a difference between things that are truths because somebody can believe something is true. They know some truths about the world that are completely false. Someone would be like, I believe my wife is not cheating on me, and they think that's a truth. They can say, okay, tell me a truth about your relationship. They believe that, but is it true? No, your wife is cheating on you or not. It's a kind of type of thing like Schrodinger's box kind of thing where the cat is alive or not. You can say something that you believe might be true about that, which is the truth, but I don't think it's actually. And now that's the kind of thing. Does the truth depends on it being true? So that's kind of thing that I don't know.
well, I think Horkheimer explains it eloquently, and I get where he's coming from. But I think at the same time, it's like they seem hell bent on writing these Marxist power dynamics into all these things when they're not factoring in that okay, identifying that the sun is the center of the universe benefited everyone long run because then we have a better understanding of the solar system. Eventually, okay, that led to astronomy, eventually space exploration, and now talking about colonization and building things in space. So yeah, it may have been done by the people in power. The people in power may have resisted change, but long run, these things benefit everyone. Like, um, it's the same thing like with certain medical care. Like, okay, maybe it was accessible only to rich people initially, but over time it became affordable to everyone. We all benefit from those advances. Again, it may not happen all at once, but it's not being done in the name of exploitation. So I feel like it's more they're starting with their conclusion of let's take the Marxist power dynamic and kind of write it into the thing rather than take a bigger picture view. That's just my take. Yeah.
Yeah, because in
Yeah.
in reality, I mean, reality in the long run wins out because it is what is. So whether you believe it's a truth or not that X is X, X will remain to be X, and if you keep interacting with X under the miscomprehension that it is Y or that's Z, it will continue to be X and whoever eventually gets into a situation where they can actually interact with it as X will be shown to have more results, I think, in whatever you're actually dealing with, to get to the point where that will actually be beneficial enough that the other people who've been like, oh, no, it's really Y, no, it's really Z, they'll eventually have to accept that, oh, X is actually showing more results. Now, like they said with science, for some science, sometimes the older scientists have to die off before they let go of a certain belief. Like before you go away from the heliocentric, from the terracentric, I don't know what it was.
Terracentric, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, from the terracentric view of the universe, those people had to die off for it to really be accepted. And the younger people were like, okay, they didn't really have the base, the invested life kind of lived experience of trying to make sense of the world with the terracentric. Then they're like, okay, heliocentric seems to give more results. So eventually we start adopting that. For some of these things, it takes generations, but then I think we're living in a time with this information age where we've had generational things that used to take generations to change have changed multiple times within like decades. It's like, oh, a decade, this is what we believed. Then a decade later, it's like, oh, we're in something else. So I think it's an exciting time to live, and that's a positive thing.
Well, do you know the whole story about cigarettes, finding out that those were bad for you with Hitler and the Marxist scientists? Did you hear that whole story?
Yeah.
So this is interesting. So Terence Keeley taught me this. He was the biochemist who explained this to me in that book, Scientocracy. So Hitler, as I think you know, was very anti-smoking, and there was actually in the movie Der Untergang, or Downfall in English, they portray this well. When Hitler died, people actually lit up cigarettes because he had a rule where he's like, don't smoke around me. This is terrible. But apparently earlier on, I guess Hitler, because he was against smoking, he basically went to these scientists and he's like, you're going to find me information that smoking is bad or else. And I guess these scientists, did studies, and they actually did find out somehow that smoking causes cancer. I don't know the details of the experiment, but of course, because the Nazis lost the war, a lot of this information, it was preserved, but it was put away. And then my dad remembers this. I'm trying to remember if it was 60s or 70s. A lot of prominent actors started dying of cancer, and they were trying to figure out, like, well, what did all these people have in common? And they figured out a lot of them were smokers. So the scientist who was a Marxist actually unearthed the stuff that the Nazis had done, and he passed it off as his own work, saying, hey, look, I've discovered that smoking is bad for you. Yeah. Now he had his own reasons for doing this, because I guess he was one of those, like, tobacco companies are part of the evil capitalist class and smoking is exploitation, all this. So, but ironically, the Nazis and this Marxist scientist ended up being right, but they also had to fight against the paradigm of all these people were smoking at that time, and they didn't want to hear smoking is bad for you. I mean, doctors were even promoting cigarettes for a time, if you recall, but they believed it enough. They were willing to put that out there, and they ended up being right. And then it became accepted by enough people. But this Marxist scientist didn't want to cite the Nazis because, of course, how would that go over? But
yeah, that's interesting. And with that, there might be some kind of relating thing out there where some of the things that are coming out with critical race theory and things like that, there might be some eugenics going on in some of the things they're talking about are rather eugenic, where they're saying inherently by you being in this certain group, having experienced these certain social effects has led you to be either deficient in certain ways where you need help from us to do this. And that is some of the stuff that was happening with eugenics. They're saying these people are deficient, so we need to either like sterilize them or quarantine them or seclude them, but they're not as capable as this other group of people, so we have to treat them differently. And there's something like that going on right now. These people are disadvantaged. They're handicapped by genetics, by their race, by virtue of them being X. So we need to treat them, we need to help them, we need to aid them in these kind of ways. So there are some of those things that are kind of coming back around. And there definitely is some truth to that, but I think it goes more on an individual level. Like, I am different from my sister is different from my brother, we're different from our parents. We have some similarities, but we're not going to have the similar results, even if you change us completely and had tried to match our environments pretty much to the T. There's going to be certain other things that are going to be involved in there. It's part of the nature and the nurture mixed together. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, James Lindsay, he even calls the woke. He loves, because they always call everyone Nazis. He's like, "What are you guys doing?" He calls it 1933 logic, and of course, that's a reference to when Hitler came to power and the Jews. Yeah. This group has all the power. This group is running everything. This group is ruining your lives, and that's the point. That was, remember what Gina Carano got in trouble for, that meme that she shared. It's showing that. And Mao actually did a similar thing. I don't know if he had his red groups. What was it? The red groups and the black groups. The red groups were like farmers, laborers, Communist Party members, and there was like one other, and then the black groups were like quote unquote rightists, landlords, the nationalists, and there was one other. And the idea was that in school he taught the red groups are good, the black groups are bad, the black groups are responsible for all the problem. So when people were violent against those, it was justified because it was seen as these groups are responsible for all our problems. Like he didn't explicitly say go out and kill these people, but he advocated violence, and he turned opinion against these people enough where violence became acceptable. And Lindsay was saying that's also analogous to the Nazis. Oh, the Jews are running everything. They lost us the war. They're ripping you off. They're stripping you of your savings, all this. And then when the government took away their rights and then eventually put them in camps, it was accepted because opinion had turned against them so much. And he was saying with the woke and with white people and others, it's the same dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the issues that's going to come up with some of these people is part of why they're rather self-centered, just focusing on the country that they live in, mostly the United States of America, because when you start looking at countries in Africa, you start looking at countries in Asia, you look at more countries in South America, and these dynamics still exist. Those social dynamics exist. I haven't really heard too many critical theorists actually put that, or postmodernists put that, like this is something that's come up multiple times in these conversations, is the caste system in India.
No.
How do they explain that? How do they actually think that? Like, do they think white people most definitely did go in there and invent them? That's something that existed before the British. And some of the British people actually were doing attempts to actually stop the caste system. And when they left, a lot of those places brought it back in full bore. And it still exists in many of the places. So how do they explain that? I mean, this hierarchies, this in-group, out-group dynamics is something that human animals, it's not even just human animals. Like we were talking about before, like racism is as natural as things like homosexuality. There's some nature and some nurture about it. There's things behind why this happens. Like it's not just anyone, it's not this entirely social construct.
Well, and like Wilfred Riley points out, they try to attribute the evil stuff to colonialism, but then it's like, we address this more in the post-colonial section, but I mean, okay, the Islamic world, I mean, the Ottoman Empire ruled from the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to like the early 20th century. Japan was never colonized. Thailand was never colonized. Ethiopia was never colonized. Nepal was never colonized. There's probably other examples. All these countries had groups of people killing each other in them. So it's like, how do you say that was white people's fault? I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Almost all those locations have had people who are living in the place that the current people live for as long as the natives were living in the United States of America before. Well, I guess because the United States of America and the North America was kind of the last place to really be colonized by people from another place. But all those places had indigenous native populations. Like there was hardly any place, like since very far back in humanity, I think that out of Africa, which is not completely 100%, there's now some people who might have come from Europe. There's been some discussions of whether the Aborigines in Australia and the neighboring areas, the Pacific Islander places, might have actually come from a different evolution, a different missing link type of place. So we might have had like even 3 different evolutionary traits, but we're all Homo sapiens now and whatnot. But anyway, so you have that thing. But since back then, those initial places, some of those places people just were wiped out due to different ice ages, different diseases, different disasters, different natural causes and things like that, or just wars within the small amounts of people that were there. But in most cases, where they are now, they've been natives. These recent nations that we call were not always by the same kind of genetic, cultural people that actually are in charge or predominant in those areas now. So that's something that's been common.
I'll send it to you later, Silas, but 23andMe keeps updating stuff, and they've traced back further and further migrations, and they trace, I think it was my matrilineal haplogroup. They traced, I guess, apparently I match with people who migrated out of East Africa something like 10,000 years ago. So you and I may have some very, very distant relatives in common.
Cool. Yeah, I guess the more information they keep getting, the more like connections they can make. It's an interesting project.
It is for sure.
One more thing here. They said, okay, the transcendent possibilities of freedom must become a driving power in the consciousness and the imagination, which prepare the soil for this revolution. And this is part of why I think it's positive to have these kind of conversations. And these kind of conversations could not really exist too many places like the West. Like I mentioned the last time, mostly it's like enough people in power get these conversations, and then they get in power and they stop any other conversations and discussions besides these ones. but you have a time and you have a culture, you have a society where people can share that First Amendment that's enshrined in the foundation of the social construct that's the United States of America is very key because it encourages people to actually have these communications. It encourages people to fail. It encourages people to say things that might be wrong, that might not be accepted by the entire group without having to lose their life. Whereas you look at the place like China and places like that, they might have had certain advancements, but how many actual ingenious things are they doing? Or how much is it just like taking ideas that have been created by other people and then crystallizing it due to the set system that they have? Like there's not too many people who are okay with, oh, I'll suggest this in the in the CCP meeting, in the meeting of the People's Party, and then it's completely taken wrong. It's like, no, it's taken wrong. You're disappeared. Like you're out.
Yeah.
You're no longer there. Oh, Emperor G says something. Maybe you should do this thing. No, you're out. Like you're disappeared. You have to just follow. So they have the ability that if they happen to catch on to something that is positive, they have the ability to just ram that through regardless and stop the other things. So occasionally they'll come up to that and something positive might seem to get success more. But then if they catch on to an idea that's faulty, it's going to take a lot longer in that kind of authoritarian, totalitarian type of society for people to question and point out how it's wrong. And that's why that's a very key thing that with this cancel culture, with this way of saying you can't, X people can only talk about this, Y people can only talk about that. That kind of environment is very dangerous, and that is something that's very regressive. That's why I call these people regressives.
Yeah.
This is not a progressive thing. This is not something about advancement. This is taking us back to the time when we had blasphemy as a typical thing of this thing. I kind of thought, like again, now talking about the difference with truth, like are we getting to a situation where a truth crime is a thing where if you say something that you consider to be true that goes against what is generally allowed to be spoken, even if you think it's true, like it's a crime to actually point out that's not true or say certain truths. It's not a good place.
Well, that's where political correctness started in the Soviet Union, because you bring that up today, the wokies will say, oh, that's just being nice. What's your issue? It's like, well, you have to understand where that came from. I mean, listen to the words carefully. Political correctness, correct according to politics. Well, who's politics? The people in charge. They decide what is correct. And there was even a joke, I guess, among Soviet party bosses, comrade, that statement's not factually correct, but it's politically correct. And that's what it means. But that's what it means. It's okay. It's what the people in power want everyone to think. So it has to align with that. It's not about, is this a factually correct thing? And if you engage a lot of these people, you see this like, oh, don't talk about this. Oh, keep this on the down low. It's like, truth is truth. It's like, it may not conform with your ideology, but that doesn't mean it's false in an objective sense. You know?
Yeah. Might need to, there's a saying that I don't think I was like, groups, relationships are defined, in groups are defined due to the lies that we tell each other. But I think it might be more accurate to say that in groups to define due to the truths that we accept together, because it's like you have to know which things are considered truths by different groups in order for you to actually fit in as a member of that in group. Because if you're just pointing out what's true, you don't really need, you just point out, oh, this is true.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, like if something happens and then it's known that in this environment, in this group, when something good happens, we say thank you Xenu. In order for you to be part of that in group, you have to know that if something positive happens in your life, you say thank you Xenu instead of being like, oh, I don't know how that happened. Because that's true to you. What's true, you don't know how that happened. But in that group, the truths that they say is if something good happened and you don't really know, chances are all positive things come from Xenu, so we say Xenu. So that's like a truth within that group. I don't know.
Well, so that's what James Lindsay talked about, what he called pseudo-reality, which he got via Jean-Francois Lyotard, the postmodern condition. And Lyotard said that I don't think he called them pseudo-reality. I think that's James Lindsay, but he called the meta-narratives. He said they're linguistic phenomena, and I thought that was a very interesting way to look at it, because you think about it, Christianity and other things, but even something like ancient Greece, we know there's no Zeus up on Mount Olympus throwing lightning bolts down. We know there's no Poseidon in the ocean, but there are people who in their minds believe that. It becomes conversation, it becomes discuss, and it becomes a whole series of beliefs that people discuss. But is it physically out there? No. And I think that's a very important point, in that Lyotard, again, he took it too far, saying everything is socially constructed, but his start of that was right. The idea that there's whole narratives that get completely constructed, people become wrapped up in, and they become so convinced that these narratives describe reality that they're afraid to venture outside of them, because then they have to confront that it's really not true. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is something that came up in a conversation I had with Adam Patrick earlier today that we've talked and we've just penciled in that we'll continue this later on. It's something that came up with the United States of America, the Declaration of Independence, the start of it, which is, to me, of a rather amazing document. This start is one thing that I really object to it, and that's like the thing about God, and God made us equal, and these are the truths that we accept. Like maybe we should get the actual quote by, but do you know the actual quote? Let me see. Declaration.
We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created
Yes,
equal. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so like that is not true.
Yeah.
It's something that if you're part of the social construct of the United States of
Yeah.
America, ostensibly that was part of a truth as part of that social construct that you hold to be self-evident, that you hold to be true. It's a truth that you hold to be true. So within that group, outside of that group, they didn't really consider that because they didn't. Did they give equal laws and rules and rights to like people who were in war with them, like the British that they just fought? Not quite. I mean, you could
No.
say it has kind of gone into part of how Americans treat countries that they've defeated in certain places, in certain locations. It hasn't been as brutal as it was in some other places. But regardless, even just the fact, first of all, I'm a religious, so I don't believe God created us. So that's not true. But that's a truth that is in there. They accepted that. And then the whole idea that we're all equal, that is most definitely not true. But currently, critical theory, some of these people, there's that dichotomy where they say, oh, we should be all equal. We should have the kind of equal results. I'm like, no, we're not equal, so we'll have unequal results. But then on the other aspect, they say certain groups are entirely different. Certain groups are always oppressed. So which one is it? Are we equal critical theorists, or are we completely unequal due to these other things in our lives? Like, you can't have them both.
James Lindsay has an excellent video he did recently. It's subscribers only. Unfortunately, I have the cheaper subscription. It's like $5 a month, but it's a very I guess it's a podcast slash video, but it's called "You Must Interact with Reality." Now you hear the name and it sounds obvious, and of course people think, well, I do that anyway. Now the reason he did this video is because people have been asking him about videos for general life advice, and what he meant in this video, he was talking, and he's obviously criticizing the woke, and he even says that, but it applies more generally, is that one of the long-running criticisms against philosophy, both from him and from other people, is that it deals with too many abstract ideas and doesn't go out into the real world and physically create things. And remember, too, his degrees are in math and physics. So, of course, physics has a lot of real life applications. But his complaint is that philosophers spend so much time dealing with all these theories, but they don't physically create anything. And he tells philosophers, he goes, go dig a hole. And it sounds like, well, what's the point? He's like, well, the dirt has a certain way to it. It has a certain smell to it. You could plant a tree in that. You can come back and see how far the tree grows. There's objective criteria here that you can measure. How much am I accomplishing? How far am I going? And that's sort of the contention between the workers and the philosophers, as Marcuse has said, and we discussed last time, of the philosophers look down, oh, those workers are uneducated, they don't know things, we're high-minded people. The workers say, well, we're physically producing things that people need. The philosophers are just in their ivory towers dealing with ideas, not producing anything. And I kind of see both sides of it, because philosophy did give us science, it did give us this country, it gave us important things, but at the same time, people do get lost in these theories and they sort of lose sight of, okay, am I actually interacting with reality? Am I creating reality? And his advice is like, whatever your views are, whatever you do, you should go out and actively create things and deal with reality. And he had some other very good points, I thought. Like, he talked about ressentiment, and Nietzsche spoke about that. The idea of resentment is just, oh, people have things and I don't like that. Whereas ressentiment, the French version, is like, you resent them, but you also have a certain hatred of people for that. And he was saying how a lot of academics, especially the woke, suffer from this because they see it as, wait a minute, I went to school, I was a top student, I got all these grades. Here's some kid who dropped out, went and started a startup, made millions of dollars. What the hell? I should be making billions. I should be running things, all this. They feel like they're not rewarded proportionate to their abilities, and that creates resentment. It's like, oh, here I am teaching, making a fraction of that. And his point is, well, look, any successful people, their success is predicated on a successful interaction with reality. And if you want to make that kind of money, you want that kind of fame, you have to go out and provide that kind of value. And again, it's not, are you valuable in the context of this philosophy? Are you valuable in academia? Are you actually improving the world in some measurable way? Are you accomplishing things in some measurable way? And if they did that, they would make a difference, but they'd also be a lot happier, because he talks too about the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it's the whole idea of real self-esteem versus pseudo self-esteem. Nathaniel Branden talked about that too, like self-esteem based on actual mastery and self-actualization versus, okay, I learned a few things, a few people told me I'm smart, a few people told me I'm incompetent, which in of itself is not bad, but it's not you delve deep into something and really mastered it. It's sort of this artificially propped up self-esteem, which isn't based on true accomplishment. It's just, okay, you learned a few things in an ideology and a few people told you were smart, but it's like, that's not true accomplishment. That's not true mastery.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very key thing with the
Yeah.
resentment. People who resent others are not, or people who just have resentment. It mostly comes from themselves. There's very few accomplished, confident people that resent other people
Yeah.
because they can look at their own life and say, okay, I've accomplished this, even though I haven't accomplished those other things that other people might not have. I think there might be people who are envious of others, say like, oh, like there's somebody who might be like accomplished in the NBA, like got to the National Basketball Association. They know their background. They came from rather dire straits, and they worked their way up. They know the hours they've put in, and they might get to the NBA. I don't think they would resent LeBron James for his genetics and for his work ethic and for his abilities, but they could be envious. Like, oh man, if I was like 6'8", like 260, like cut like LeBron James, maybe I'd be able to have something else. But instead, I'm 6'2", I can't really put on weight, like I'm a little less coordinated. So they might be envious, but I don't think they would resent LeBron James for him also putting in similar sort of work to achieve something in that, especially something that they can relate to how much work it must have taken to be as skilled as the things that he's doing. So yeah, I think that's a very key thing to think of.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it here, but there was a good there was that sort of like informal graph about the Dunning-Kruger effect, and I was thinking of a lot of woke people. They sort of say on the left side of that, where they delve into something briefly and they think they know everything. But I feel like a lot of them stay on that side where it's that pseudo self-esteem of, yeah, I know all this stuff, but it's like, yeah, you know stuff within a particular ideology. You may be smart among your friends, but can you go out and engage the wider world, engage people who disagree with you, prove them wrong, enact policies that bring about lasting change? That stuff's way harder. And if you look at, I'll try to dig up this chart here for you, but like that stuff's much harder. But the thing is, if they did that, they would achieve actual self-esteem because it would be a struggle, but they would actually learn things. And then long run, it's like, wow, I'm proud I accomplished something. I'm not just dealing in the realm of theory.
Yeah. Now that's one thing I'd wonder. Would someone like Marcuse have what resentments would he possibly have? And then as we were talking in the start, when I was talking about the like instead of God, let's say religion is actually things that fill in the unknown unknowns hole, the known unknowns holes, where somebody might dabble into something and find out about a certain aspect of society. And since these things might actually take a lot of effort to actually become cognizant of it, but you understand this actually has a lot of effect, you might just religiously say, okay, I'm going to accept critical theory. I'm going to accept republicanism. I'm going to accept socialism. I'm going to accept the X party because my parents were in this party. If you're in some place, I'm going to accept the tribal chief understands what's supposed to happen because I know that the tribal chief is part of this nation. And then there's these people in this capital city of Nairobi that I've never really been to. But this chief seems to know the main minister here and they're related somehow. And then the minister I know keeps coming back from Nairobi in his really posh vehicle. And when he comes back, he throws these parties, he gives us chickens, he does these things. So that person just automatically will accept their chiefdom as a kind of religion, as a kind of faith, and just have faith in that structure without really understanding because they know that chief is a chief. He's a part of the structure. But for them to sit down and try to understand and accept what Kenya is as part of a nation and the structures that go in, I don't think for some people they would want to do that. So you can just kind of take certain things on faith. And I think, yeah, that's the more accurate thing. Faith is what we put into the known unknown holes. Because if you had an explanation for something, if you had evidence for something, you wouldn't say faith. You'd provide the evidence for
Yeah.
that belief system. Yeah.
I just sent the chart to your Facebook Messenger. We could probably maybe put it up on the screen during this presentation. And
Okay.
it's useful. I mean, it's kind of an informal graph. It's not like a serious study or anything, but like, I feel like a lot of woke people start on the left side of this. Like, I know everything. Like, oh, I learn a few things. I'm confident in my circle. But then when you start to talk to them, you're gradually pulling them to the right. Okay, I don't know as much as I thought. Then they feel uncomfortable, and then they just run back to the left side. And ultimately, that's a very bad place to be in because it's sort of that temporary security of, yeah, I know a few things. I'm confident in that. but then bigger picture, long run, it's not as productive because you're not fully actualized, and you don't gain the true self-esteem of, okay, I've actually learned all this material and I understand it. It's not, you're just confident in that bubble.
Yeah, I think that's it for the so a good healthy discussion for the first paragraph. So let's move on to the next excerpt.
Sure. The new sensibility, which expresses the ascent of the life instincts over aggressiveness and guilt, would foster, on a social scale, the vital need for the abolition of injustice and misery, and would shape the further evolution of the quote-unquote standard of living. The life instincts would find rational expression, in parentheses, sublimation, in planning the distribution of the socially necessary labor time within and among the various branches of production, thus setting priorities of goals and choices, not only what to produce, but also the quote-unquote form of the product. The liberated consciousness would promote the development of a science and technology free to discover and realize the possibility of things and men in the protection and gratification of life, playing with the potentialities of form and matter for the attainment of this goal. Technique would then tend to become art, and art would tend to form reality. The opposition between imagination and reason, higher and lower faculties, poetic and scientific thought would be invalidated. Emergence of a new reality principle under which a new sensibility and a desublimated scientific intelligence would combine in the creation of an aesthetic ethos.
Okay. Again, this just goes back to these people who are artists inherently.
Yeah.
These have some aspect to that. And to me, like, there's that whole thing, like the question of life, like, what is life? Or then you apply that to art. What is considered artistic? And to me, it's what, is art? Like, to me, if you're doing something because you ask what, instead of just doing the thing that's just practical, if you just simply make a lever because you're just like, I'm just creating a lever and putting a rock and a stick so I can just leave that thing over and get that rock. That's very practical and direct. The what is like, oh, what if I make some kind of part in there that makes it easier for the hand to do it? What if I put like some designs on it to make it more attractive for somebody to have some enjoyment? That's more when you actually look at what the thing is. What else can you add to it? I think those extra questions are part of the things in art. So this is something I would ask Marcuse if I could, like, what was he actually talking about in some of these things? So I can kind of relate and maybe try to think of what's he getting at with that. What are some of the things you were seeing from this?
Well, what I was going to say, there's a few things here. So it's interesting how he puts standard of living in quotes, because I guess the idea is that under the Marxist utopia, everyone has what they need. So there's no real standard of living. Everyone just has what they need. I saw Dr. Zhivago the other day. I don't know if you watch that at all. And it's interesting because they talk about it has to do with the Russian Revolution. It's a love story. It's a very long movie. It's over 3 hours. It's okay. I mean, it's a romance. It's not a documentary, so it focuses more on the characters. But some of the Communist Party members talk about, like, oh, I have no personal life. My life is to the party now. And it's a similar dynamic here where it's like, oh, there is no standard of living. I don't have a bigger TV than my neighbor. I don't have a bigger house. We all have the same. So I think that's why he puts standard of living in quotes. The idea is everyone is supposed to have the same stuff. How this would be achieved to me is magic, but yeah.
With the standard of living, that made me kind of think of the living wage. When someone's like, oh, you need a living wage to do this. And I just ask people, like, the quality of life, first of all, the quality of life that you have now, I think if you're having a living wage. Now, what quality of life do they imagine would this living wage support? And how much do they think somebody back when Marcuse was writing, I mean, I guess you could count the inflation and things like that, would have to earn in order to have the living wage that they're talking about? How much work and time and hours do they think those people were actually putting in order to have the living wage that they think, like, some of the things they have access to are way better than the things that they had at that time. And lastly with that, I try to ask them, like, this standard of living, do they imagine that there's other countries or other times when the socio-political system, the political system, some of the economic systems, the social interactions were more just and accurate to the things that they want to see United States of America and the West become, that they look at those places and be like, yes, their racial relations are better. Yes, the relation between genders are better. Yes, their economic systems are better there. They're following more what critical theory claims to want and what the communism claims to want. What is to each what they want. What was it? What's the thing with, like,
from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs.
Do they think there's places like that that match that better, that have given a better quality of life than they have in the United States of America now. But of course, a lot of them will say that was not real communism, it was not true. And then critical theory is relatively new. But what do they think? If they can say, if we do this, we think society will be like this. But I hardly see that any actual markers for them to actually say that you can actually test them on. It's more just like, let's do this, and then things will get better. Like,
well,
okay.
well, remember, he talks about that in Repressive Tolerance. He talks about historical possibilities or something, meaning he feels it's possible this could happen, but he doesn't say we should do this like this country did. They had this, and this was the result. And this comes up a lot when I debate people on the healthcare stuff, especially with the Scandinavian countries. Like, people say, oh, in these countries they have quote unquote free healthcare, but then I point out, well, you have to look at Sweden in particular. Sweden hasn't had a war in over 100 years, so it's like they've just been building up stuff. They have a lot of iron ore, they have a lot of oil. It's a wealthy per capita country. They have very low obesity rates. They don't have diabetes, heart attacks, other things that we have. So it's a lot easier to have that sort of system. And oh yeah, then on top of it, they pay taxes through the nose. So it's like it's not this utopia that you envision. Like, this comes at other costs,
Yeah. And with some of these things, this liberated consciousness that would promote and the development of science and technology, which societies do they think have made more advancements in science and technology compared to others? And what sociopolitical systems were those countries going on? And in this current case, the United States of America outpaces most other countries in pretty much every field when it comes to actual advancements in science. Like, people say, oh, they spend this highest amount of money in healthcare. It's like, yes, you look at the amount of actual things that are developed in the healthcare field, and majority of them, it's like 90% of them, come to the United States of America. That's part of the research and development. United States of America, at least that's one field where the United States of America still is the research and development capital of the world on medical type of things. So those are the type of things where it's like, science and technology wise, who's actually developing that? And would they say, due to the fact that the United States of America has developed so many of them, or the West in general, would that make the West the most liberated consciousness kind of place? I don't know if they'd say that.
Well, so it's interesting here. What was I gonna say? So it's interesting he uses the word form in quotes. I think that's a reference to Plato, who he's going to reference in a little bit. So then what else was I going to say here? Art forming reality, then imagination, and then invalidated a new reality principle. I thought that was an interesting way of looking at it, as opposed to reality is objective. It'd be a new reality. Yeah. So there will be some Kant references too, but like, it's kind of some kind of interesting stuff, I suppose.
So that new reality principle could be part of that lived experience type of thing.
Oh, one thing that was interesting too, there's that book, The Cave and the Light, which is that book about Plato and Aristotle and how they've influenced Western history. And the author, Arthur Herman, made a point that I hadn't thought of, but kind of makes sense now. How, if you notice Hegel's writing, a lot of things are capitalized. Like, he talks about the spirit, the world spirit, all this. In German, the nouns are capitalized. I don't know if you know that, but he was saying that that's sort of fitting because it almost is a kind of a Platonist theme. The idea of like, this is my ideal spirit, this is my ideal world, this is my reason is capitalized. Like, it kind of makes sense almost that it would work like that. Yeah.
So it's more like a subjective thing, where like, this is reason to this group of people. Like, this is an object reason rather than the existence of reason.
Yeah, reason is the spirit that perfects history, essentially, and reason is operating through people, through the dialectic.
Okay, I might actually mesh with someday, because I was kind of thinking how the stories we tell about reality isn't a story, but we tell stories about reality. So the story was the capitalized kind of noun of what reality is, but reality exists without that identification of it being reality.
Yeah.
That's the same thing. Like, what's true is true, and then truth, I think, would be capitalized in that sense, where this is a truth because it's a agreed construct that we use to identify something that we've observed in the limited way that we can observe that thing. Yeah.
Yeah, because like I say, in German, that's the structure of the grammar, but he makes sense that this is a Platonist philosophy, because if you're talking about your world of forms, or it's at least sort of based on those themes, it would make sense that everything's capitalized, because this is pure reason, this is the pure spirit, this is the world, this is the end of history. All of that is capitalized. It kind of makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
All right. So next one. The term quote unquote aesthetic in its dual connotation of quote unquote pertaining to the senses and quote unquote pertaining to art may serve to designate the quality of the productive creative process and environment of freedom. Technique, assuming the features of art, would translate subjective sensibility into objective form into reality. This would be the sensibility of men and women who do not have to be ashamed of themselves anymore because they have overcome their sense of guilt. They have learned not to identify themselves with the false fathers who have built and tolerated and forgotten the Auschwitzes and Vietnams of history, the torture chambers of all the secular and ecclesiastical inquisitions and interrogations, the ghettos and the monumental temples of the corporations, and who have worshipped the higher culture of this reality. If and when men and women act and think free from this identification, they will have broken the chain which linked the fathers and sons from generation to generation. They will not have redeemed the crimes against humanity, but will have become free to stop them and to prevent their recommencement. Chance of reaching the point of no return to the past, if and when the causes are eliminated which have made the history of mankind the history of domination and servitude. These causes are economic, political, but since they have shaped the very instincts and needs of men, no economic and political changes will bring the historical continuum to a stop unless they are carried through by men who are physiologically and psychologically able to experience things and each other outside the context of violence and exploitation.
Okay. Now here there is the general aspect of something we talked last time. Instead of history repeats itself, history rhymes. So there is an aspect there. And I think a key thing here is there's some erasure of history. Now, I can get into the talks and I can see where some people can make a case and say, oh, let's not have statues to certain people. But when they say let's not even teach certain things as part of history, that gets very problematic because that's when you get to the point where I think part of the reason the West is doing better than other places is because they read and talk about the history. And yes, the West itself, and this is very something natural to humanity, has fallen into that aspect where they just want to tell the good stories. But I think in the United States of America, more than many other places, you are open to actually talk about the garbage things that you've done in the past as a culture, as a society.
Yeah.
You can't really do that in China, in a place like China, for example.
No.
So is that going to be something more beneficial? As much of the struggle that we're going through, these struggle sessions and things like that in the United States of America and the West, I do think that still is preferable than having a place like China where the Communist Party of China is just like, no, everything we did in the past was completely okay. We can't talk about any of the bad things that we did. That's another extreme, and I don't think what's happening in the United States of America is anywhere close yet to the extreme. But the people who are saying, let's actually jettison even talking about the things that we did in the past because they're so bad, that is still kind of sort of similar in result, because in result then you'll start talking about the things that are good. Now in the United States of America and the West, the difference will be they think it'll be more them deciding, the general populace deciding what is considered good and rewriting things and retelling things, reimagining things. But it still comes to the point where I think it's good to focus and make known the horrible things that are happening. And I think a recent example was Muhammad Anwar just got in he was in a car in the Navy Yard in Washington D.C. area, and two young black females like tried to carjack him, and he was fighting back. They tased him a few times. He drove off, and then had a car accident. They had a car crash around the corner, and he was thrown out of the car and ended up dying from his injuries. Yeah. Now, that story is being posted, and I saw some people saying, "Oh, how can you post this information out there? Like, it's you shouldn't post this out. It's insensitive." Then the person was like, "Oh, what do you think his family thinks?" Like, have you asked them? Then the family came out, and they're like, "Oh, there's a note from the family saying we would like you not to share this." But I'm like, I take that into consideration, but I still think it's worth sharing because people should see what's happening. People should see this actual thing. You're not forcing anyone to watch it. The family member's not forcing it. It's something that happened in public. It's of public interest. It's not something as the actions going on. If you think about what's going on, is horrific, is horrible, but it's not a grotesque thing. Like you don't see like blood or it's no curse words and things like that. But it's something to see that's happening. And it's like I ask people like that, if George Floyd's family had come out and said, "Don't show her the video," do people think they should have stopped showing the video? It's like no, people need to see what happened. Like it's some people need to see to believe that this is happening, and I think that's more positive. So the bad things, I think we need to focus on that. We need to see how much worse things were in the past in order to avoid going to those places again and understanding and valuing the things that we've done to come from that place, I think.
Yeah, and as I touch on, there's another great Lindsay video about the creation of a new American mythology, how it is true that there were a lot of people who romanticized America's past. But and the thing is, some of the stuff the critical theorists say they is right. Like, they did downplay certain atrocities, obviously slavery, segregation, Indian removal, all that. But at the same time, what they're doing is basically an overcorrection. It's you don't go so far in the other direction that you forget that no, America has done a lot of great stuff too. And there has to be just a balanced approach here. We have to acknowledge that the good things here are not shouldn't be taken for granted, but let's not pretend it was all apple pie, baseball, fireworks, and everything either. Yeah.
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 I think that's it for me on this paragraph.
All right. Let's see here. All right. Let's see here. This. So all I was gonna say. Let me see here. Yeah, it seems to be sort of the Soviet new man thing where he talks about men that are physiologically and psychologically able to experience things in each other outside of violence and exploitation. I think he would say that the current system is exploitive, but people are able to move beyond that. That's, again, I feel like that's just the Soviet new man argument. And he sort of talks about that in the last section, the whole biological foundation for socialism. Like, I haven't read Eros and Civilization, but I guess in there he talks about like, oh, under socialism, a new kind of person would evolve to be able to do these things. And, it's again, that's the whole Soviet new man thing, but I'm not going to go there.
Yeah, the Ubermensch, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's I think that's where it comes to that epigenetics thing. Like, how are they going to select for this new person? Like, how are they going to teach this new person? They say, okay, we need to free them from the schools. We need to have this kind of new way of thinking, reimagining things. So how is that going to happen?
Well, you know who Lysenko was, right? The whole biologist in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
He was the one. He tried to engineer a Soviet biology and the idea that, oh, if we expose crops to the cold, they'll become hardier and they'll grow better and all that. But instead, it led to mass famine. And the thing is, China borrowed a lot from him too. So you could argue that his ideas led to millions of deaths. And what's scary is that some of the stuff Marcuse is saying here, it kind of reminds me of that. Oh, we're going to somehow engineer people to get the result we want, but in reality, it just leads to millions of deaths. And what do you have to show for it?
Yeah, how many people are like that? It's just people don't realize. That's what I'm saying. It's thank you if you've taken your time to listen to this. There's probably more important things you could be doing with your time than this. That's why I'm thanking you that much more to have taken your time first with Stephen to have this conversation and for the people listening, because there's other things that you can be doing. And those things you might think are not important. It's like you might be someone like Lysenko, but doing something on the opposite side to figure out something that it really doesn't take that many people. That's why it's worth having these conversations, worth having these discussions. Be okay to fail. Interact, like James Lindsay says, interact with reality. Like, get out there, get your ideas out there. If there's something that's unknown to you that you think you know how you could actually make it known, make it known. Don't accept these unknowns in your life. Don't just fall. Yes, cancel culture is out there. Yes, you might get in trouble for doing something, but chances are you live in a world where you won't lose your life for it. But by you going out there and actually saying things, you might save countless of lives. You might improve your life infinitely in ways that you don't even know possible by actually testing something out. So please, I just encourage people, get out there and talk, because there's people out there who are trying to reduce the amount that you can talk. But if you're listening to this, chances are you live in a location where you have an unprecedented access to information that has existed in human existence and unprecedented living in a society and culture, even if it's not specifically in the United States. Most of the places in the West are places where you're actually rather open to actually having conversations. And I look at most of the people who actually listen to this channel, this content, are people in the West. So yeah, that's a little aside there.
And as I and others have pointed out, the woke only make about 10% of the population. That also gets into how many are committed versus how many are going along. If every single person who opposes the insanity speaks up, they have no power. It has to take a substantial portion of people. But it's like, if everyone just gets scared and is quiet, well, I mean, the Nazis and the Bolsheviks were small percentages of the population to gain power. But if everyone is just, oh, I'm scared of this small group, I won't say anything. Well, that you're giving them power that they really shouldn't have.
Yeah, and if you're doing this before, like, you can test that. I understand some people have situations, so you can even word it in this way. Be like, if we've said something that chances are, if you're listening to this content, some of the things we're saying are things you thought of before. We're not blowing your mind with brand new information. Maybe we're saying things in a different way than you thought before. But from my experience of listening to other people who are making content similar to this, that's been my experience. I'm like, oh, you put it in a way that I hadn't thought of before. Oh, that reminds you of that. So if you want to talk about this, someone brings it up. Instead of saying, oh, this is what I think, be like, Silas, I was listening to this crazy thing with this guy, Silas and Steven. It's crazy people, man. And then they said this about this thing that you're saying. So what do you think about what they said? Like, you can put it that way. And then you can get more information about it. And one last thing on this, Mike Rowe, who's someone I really look up to, he was like in Dirty Jobs, and he's done like Giving Back, which is an excellent idea of a show where he just went to different places in the United States of America to people who had given to their society and their culture and their community, and then he'd give back to them somehow. But he has this micro works thing. He's pushing people getting more into like the trades and things like that. So he gives scholarships. He's a really great guy, like really inspirational guy to me, as someone I look up to. And he had this one tweet, and this is something that I've repeated to people. Why do certain people seem to think they have undue power over you? You're giving these people power. Yeah. Someone wrote to him like, "Oh, if you're related to PragerU, I've lost your respect." I don't like Dennis Prager's content that much because it comes from the religious aspect. I am very religious. I have questions with him, but it's not a kind of situation where I loathe stuff that much. But then Mike Rowe's response to this person was like, "What is it in your life that has made you think that somebody who has never met you would value your opinion enough and want your respect?" You know, that whole aspect, like, I ask you out there, before you actually worry, some people have very practical reasons to actually, if I say this, they rather certain they'll lose their job, and that job is feeding their kids. I understand people in those situations. But most people in personal relationships, they don't want to talk about these things. I'd say, at least in those situations, maybe just push that. Like, why are you giving this random person power over you in that kind of sense? Why do you respect their opinion over you? We're not living in a prehistory time where the 100 people that you see around you, you have to be in their good terms. Otherwise, one day you're going to be out there. Some randoms online come and say something. Why do you take any umbrage, or why do you take any harm from that? You're giving them way too much power than they should have over you.
Yeah, and the thing is too, anyone who deals with the woke enough, they realize they're bullies, and that's how they are. Like, you know, oh, if you post this or say these things, people will think you're racist. It's like, I don't care. That's the equivalent of a Christian fundamentalist calling me a sinner, or a Islamist calling me an infidel. It's like, I don't subscribe to that belief system. It doesn't matter if they look down on me within the framework of that belief system. They don't run my life. You know?
Yeah. Like, I don't consider that a truth. Like, that's the thing. Like, your truth is not something that I consider true. So have at it. Yeah. All
right. So there's a bit here about Kant and aesthetics. I didn't feel the need to read this. Like, if you want to delve more into the philosophy, you may find it interesting. I don't feel it's particularly relevant to today. I'm just going to read the next two paragraphs. They're both kind of short. So, the new sensibility has become, by this very token, praxis. It emerges in the struggle against violence and exploitation, where the struggle is waged for essentially new ways and forms of life. Negation of the entire establishment, its morality, culture, affirmation of the right to build a society in which the abolition of property and toil terminates in a universe where the sensuous, the playful, the calm, and the beautiful become forms of existence, and thereby the form of society itself. The new sensibility has become, by this very token, praxis. It emerges in the struggle against violence and exploitation, where the struggle is waged for essentially new ways and forms of life. Negation of the entire establishment, its morality, culture, affirmation of the right to build a society in which the abolition of poverty. Oh, wait, did I read the? Oh, I copied the same thing twice, huh? It's funny. Yeah, sorry about that. I copied. All right, never mind. So, do you just have any thoughts on that before I read the next thing?
Okay. Very token praxis. Okay, what's praxis? So there's praxis that company is doing great work.
Yeah. So, well, what's interesting is praxis. It comes from the Greek word. It means action. And if you remember, one of the aspects of critical theory is, because that's what they're doing. And with the people in praxis are interested in philosophy and all this. It goes back to Greece, obviously. But Marx also used this term to mean taking action as far as overthrowing the system. And then critical theory itself, Horkheimer talks about the three aspects. It has to be nominative, nominative, descriptive, and then actionable. Also uses the word praxis. So it has to be able to describe the status quo, it has to come up with the ideal, and then it has to have some actionable way. So he's using that word deliberately, because he's saying in terms of aesthetics, there has to be some actionable path to take for new aesthetics, struggle against this. And it's interesting too, notice he capitalizes the word form. Again, that's a reference to Plato and the Hegelian, the form of society. That's his ideal society. And negation, again, that's a Hegelian thing, the Aufhebung or Aufhebung idea.
Yeah, and that's definitely something you see in critical theory. There's this attempt to negate the status quo and reimagine everything and replace everything, rethink everything. And some of the things, it's healthy, but if you're not allowed to have a discussion, they say, no, this needs to go. We need to rethink this. But they don't really seem that willing. Many of them don't really seem that willing to discuss what we're going to replace those things with, if those things were making some kind of situation positive, if there were an improvement on the things in the past. So those are the kind of questions that I'm saying. I'm not saying, I personally don't believe really anything is sacrosanct. There's a few things like peaceful parenting that I think is, yeah, private property is probably one of the things I just kind of won't move on, like, because to be an individual and a human being that has ownership of your actions and has some socially created human right to actually, or just any right to animals, to have that sense where it's like, yes, I'm going to respect you as an individual, not to violate your corpus and things like that. That comes from private property because your mind owns that. I don't have ownership over your body, and then private property goes from all that. And that's why it spreads to peaceful parenting, because the child is a child. I don't have the right to be violent. And then the non-aggression principle, zero aggression principle comes from that. So those are the few things that I'm kind of absolutist on. But everything else, I'm like, yeah, how are we going to interact together as a society? Those are the things I'm kind of always just, in general, just putting it up on board. As long as people are deciding and willing to engage in agency and with their agency and choose to have interactions, then in that situation, there's very few things I'm like, okay, let's not talk about that.
Yeah. Trying to think. Yeah, I don't think I've really much else to say. It's just the usual, like, oh, we have to negate the current oppression. We'll have our ideal society. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
All
make the case for it if that's your stance. Yeah.
All right. Next paragraph. By virtue of these qualities, the aesthetic dimension can serve as a sort of gauge for a free society, a universe of human relationships no longer mediated by the market, no longer based on competitive exploitation or terror, demands a sensitivity freed from the repressive satisfactions of the unfree societies, a sensitivity receptive to forms and modes of reality which thus far have projected only by the aesthetic imagination. For the aesthetic needs have their own social content. They are claims of the human organism, mind and body, for a dimension of fulfillment which can be created only in the struggle against the institutions which, by their very functioning, deny and violate these claims. The radical social content of the aesthetic needs becomes evident as the demand for the most elementary satisfaction is translated into group action on an enlarged scale. From their harmless drive for better zoning regulations and a modicum of protection from noise and dirt, to the pressure for closing of whole city areas to automobiles, prohibition of transitory radios in all public places, decommercialization of nature, total urban reconstruction, control of the birth rate, such action would become increasingly subversive of the institutions of capitalism and of their morality. The quantity of such reforms would turn into the quality of radical change to the degree to which they would critically weaken economic, political, and cultural pressure and power groups which would have a vested interest in preserving the environment and ecology of profitable merchandising.
Now, again, this goes to the definition of capitalism. I've done a separate video talking about the initial definition of capitalism, that at this time when Marcuse was writing this was more the generally accepted definition of capitalism, because around this time is also when I think it was Mises Rothbard got it, and then they kind of changed it into more what the libertarian circles type of people on the political right imagine as capitalism. That is specifically free market capitalism. And then now we're getting into a time with shareholder capitalism, with the Great Reset and the globalization movement. But that's something else. But there's different forms of capitalism. Like I said before, when China came through after the what is it? It would say the Great Revolution. What was it?
Well, it was the Great Leap Forward. That was the industrialization. And then there was the Cultural Revolution where Mao tried to take back power. That was a bit later.
So they started adopting certain capitalist principles. It wasn't capitalism. It wasn't even capitalism. Like, I don't think it was a sort of capitalism that, if Marcuse was saying, oh, you said like, oh, they're becoming more capitalist. I don't know if Marcuse would agree with that, with his definition of what it was. But I think that aspect is it's important to kind of realize that he's not talking about free market capitalism when he says this right here, because all these things that are happening in a free market capitalism, if there is demand for it, there will be people providing for that. If this was the private sector where they're the means of production are in the private sector. Capital itself, once you got to the point where there's fiat currency and there's no competition in that point, you can't really have that pure free market capitalism kind of sense, because you're always going to be, in that sense, you're going to be using a controlled, a key means of trade is a controlled thing by the public sector. So inherently, you're not going to have true free market capitalism anywhere in the world right now until you have, and things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency might get to the point where they actually give us a chance to have something closer to a true free market of capitalism, but a free market capitalist system. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that part. What do you think about that?
All right. So what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, it's interesting too. He talks about human relationships no longer mediated by the market. I recently rewatched Fiddler on the Roof as well, and I don't know if you remember, but one of the characters in that is a Marxist. Have you seen Fiddler on the Roof first off?
I have a long time ago. I think I was like in my teens. So it's
so remember, it follows a Jewish family in Russia, but it's like at the early 20th century. So of course, this is when the Jews are being oppressed, and of course, this ultimately leads to the Bolshevik Revolution. Not solely because of that. There's other things too. But one of the characters who ends up falling in love with Tevye, the main character, his daughter, he's a Marxist. They don't say it explicitly, but he talks about like the rich are evil. One day their wealth will be ours. And later he gets arrested at a demonstration. He's waving a red flag. So, you know, they never mention Marxism specifically, but that's clearly what he is. And when he proposes marriage, though, he talks about like, you know, I'd like to enter a socioeconomic arrangement with you, and they're talking about marriage. He goes, would you be interested in such an arrangement? And I think it's interesting because that's actually a very Marxist idea, because they see everything through the lens of economics, and they believe that Marx called economics the infrastructure, and then the superstructure is what's happening around it. So culture is an offshoot of economics, but economics are what drives everything. So I thought it was interesting that they tie that theme in, that he sees marriage as, okay, this is all about economics, and then it's not about love, even though he is in love with her, but it's no, this is a socioeconomic relationship. And I feel like Marcuse is kind of echoing that sentiment in this writing here.
No, when it comes to marriage, I'm not completely against that.
No.
It is a financial kind of arrangement, and there is that care and love aspect of it, where if you care and love for somebody, chances are you're going to work harder to provide for that person, to enrich that person, and then when you care and you create another life, you'll again work harder. And there's just things you can see when it comes to males who are more judged on the amount of production and resource provision that they can get. There's just a clear thing. I think it's something like on average, a married man earns 100% more. Like a bachelor needs to earn like 10% what on average a married man does. Now that's for various reasons. A married man is often supporting at least one other person, and his wife, at least in some sense, in the traditional sense, and that's changing a bit in societies. Now I'd wonder what would be the difference now with the slow change on women. You might get to a situation where in men, you see on average a married man earns more, but for women, there might be an inverse where on average, a single woman earns a lot more because she's kind of supporting herself in that kind of sense. So there could be something to see in there. So
historically, the economic stuff was true. Like the idea of, okay, what is a dowry? It's okay, I'm bringing this to the marriage so I can get a better man. And then they bring that up in Fiddler on the Roof too, about like, oh, I'm in love with the rabbi's son, why shouldn't I have the best? It's like, well, you're a poor girl from a poor family. The rabbi is the leader of the village. And then earlier on, she's engaged to the butcher, and the butcher makes good money. So that's like, oh, good, you can move up in the world. But then, of course, the daughter's saying, well, he's old, I'm not attracted to him, all that. And then they don't want him to marry the tailor because the tailor's poor. So those economic things do play out. It's not entirely irrelevant, but I just think it's interesting that they look at it economically first, and then the other things are anterior to that.
Yeah, if it's not financial, women want to say it's about love. Then why do 90% of marriages have the women earning more, the man earning more? Like, why are women regularly surveyed, and they say if they earn more than the man, they just feel the attraction kind of like loses. You can blame the gender wage gap, but I think this is something that's inherently there.
Well, and again, the only other thing I would say is it's that last point about talking about people preserving the status quo, which I agree. But again, it's like, who are you talking about preserving the status quo? Like, Ibram X. Kendi wants everyone to think that racism's everywhere all the time because he makes money. If enough people wake up and realize he's full of shit, well, what's he going to do? What's he going to do for a living? It's like, oh, here, guys, let me listen to me talk about Jim Crow. It's like, nobody cares. I mean, you know.
That's one weird thing about these. Like, I do understand for some of these people, it's just, I need to get a job. I need to make a living. I need to earn a living, because inherently people understand that. Like, this whole idea to earn a living did not begin with when the invention of currency. It's existed
No.
before, and animals and life forms understand they have to do certain actions in order to live. Like a lion isn't out there like, oh, I just like killing gazelles. They understand I got to kill this gazelle. If there's no gazelles, I got to try to tackle that water buffalo.
Yeah.
It would prefer to tackle like little child gazelles with no horns all day, every day. But then
Yeah.
sometimes it's like, if I don't risk this buffalo, this water buffalo that could gore me and kill me, I'm going to die anyway. So I got to do these
Yeah.
actions. So with some of these people, they literally just gotten bamboozled, or nobody told them. They just got some kind of system and stuck into it, where just like the schools themselves and the whole Ivory Tower series that we were talking about, with the different structures and the things that have led to that smorgasbord of things. So many people have been suckered into that. And they find themselves there, and like, I can't get out. And they're like, what am I going to do? So they're like, okay, I have to get more students in here. I'm not going to tell them that there's low chances for them to get jobs if they actually take my course, because your course is going to get fired. You're going to get kicked out. You got kids, you got people to care about. Well, anyway, people come out, and women, you see this, and it's really tough. Women see this. You see men going MGTOW because they were kind of lied to about the nature of females, and females are these amazing beings that are just sugar spice and everything nice, and they actually interact with these actual human beings, and they see the flaws, and they see the different expectations that they have, and they don't really, it's not this Madonna creature. And then they kind of get like, this is horrible, like women suck. It's like, no, some people suck, some people don't. Like, it's work. Relationships in general are work. You work through yourself, and then you interact and you build a relationship, and you build from there. You see a lot of women who are convinced. You see these women in their 30s and 35, and like, I'm ready to settle. How come men are not coming? Like, I'm not getting men. Like, I've achieved all these things. I'm making six figures. Like, I have all these degrees, and they're like, men don't care about that stuff. Like, you were lied to. So it's kind of like, it's a sad situation where people don't understand there is a transaction. And we're going to get to the human action conversation after this, or sometime soon. And that one, everything is economics. Everything does have economics. Money, currency is just one way to trade, but economics, everything is an exchange. There are win-win situations, there are lose-lose situations, but everything is an exchange. Like, you're choosing to spend your time here, listen to this, and hopefully we're giving you some benefit back to it. And that's just how the entire world works.
When they talk about, okay, I'm ready to settle down, I shouldn't say this, but I always think of that meme featuring the roast beef sandwich. Like, this girl's
Oh,
like,
yeah.
when people say that, I just think of that
Toxic masculinity. We should put a toxic masculinity trigger warning for like 1:30 on the.
And
Okay.
well, and the other thing I thought of too, I don't know if I sent it to you, but I talked to a few other people about this, about that woman who is a matchmaker but became disillusioned because she's like, she talked about, she complained about male clients, but also mostly female clients. She said like she had all these women who are like, I want the perfect guy, and she's like, I'm not creating a Frankenstein's monster where I can mix and match different parts and create,
Yeah.
it's like you have to accept that, okay, there's a guy who may make good money, but he's going to be busy all the time. There may be a guy who's tall and good looking, but doesn't make much money. There may be a guy who, you know, he may have those traits, but then he's either taken or he's very picky. It's like you can imagine your ideal guy, but that doesn't mean he's available. And if he is he going to be interested? You have to have a more realistic expectation here. No.
And that's the thing. I think that part of that, where there were certain traits that we looked for in the opposite genders when you wanted to couple in that heterosexual way in order to reproduce, that are very mutated by the current system of the state. Because, like I was asking before, the quality of life that you have, the access to resources that people have, this whole idea in the United States of America, living on debt, living on credit, where you don't actually engage in the actions. That phone you have is not something you directly have. So in order to have a thing like a phone in your hand, that you are aware that it took thousands of people and all these resources to get that thing to you, people have that genetically, where life forms understand it took the effort of me and the rest of my group in order to have this resource, and you start to appreciate it. And in general, in that sense, you were like, in this group of males, of Homo sapien males, that one is gaining this many resources, is gaining resources 10. Everybody else is up 2. So in general, you're going to be attracted to the 10. So if on average, through the state and the redistribution of wealth, people in the welfare state, people are already at the level of 10, they're living in a kind of society where they feel, as a female, I exist in a sense to get resources of a 10. So I should also demand the physical male that is the 10, not realizing that you have the resources of a 10, not because you deserve that 110 to supply to you, but because there's been a whole bunch of fives and sixes who've happened to get positions of power to gain resources from 100 ones and then
Yeah.
get those things to you as a 10. So I think people are living in a kind of in a situation where they're feeling in that point where it's like, oh, I demand this resource. They haven't adjusted their actual like sexual marketplace value, for lack of a better term, with it. And it's also happened on the inverse of the males, where they're like, oh, since all these things can be provided, they have these things already. So at the same point, I'm going to demand a female of a certain value, a certain attractiveness. And it's like, you probably can't really get that because you personally are not really able to provide certain things to that person. So there's a situation where with this zeitgeist change that we're going through, there's a lot of fluctuations, a lot of misconceptions in the stock market of the sexual marketplace, I think.
Well, like I worked with this girl. She's probably about 21 now. Kind of cute, like good looking girl, fairly intelligent. Like she and I were talking about these issues. And I guess, she's attractive, but I guess she had been ghosted a few times and things like that. So it's like she realizes she's not all that. And I told her about this matchmaker and stuff, and she was actually sort of in agreement because I made the point like, okay, you want a guy who's 6 foot tall. Well, what percentage of men are over 6 foot? And then like you want a guy who has money. Well, to be in the 1%, I mean, it's the 1%. It's like you're already talking about a small percentage. Then you have to have a guy who have both. It's even fewer. Then are they single? Are they interested? And you keep narrowing it down. You're basically chasing like, like not even a single digit percentage of the population. And realistically, can you or most people get that? The answer is no. I mean, if you're a celebrity or you stand out or you have connections in some way, but for the average person, no, not so much.
Yeah, and also like where are these men? That's one thing that's
Yeah.
key. I think the way universities, schools used to be in their heyday. I think when people in the 50s and the 60s were looking at these other people going to school, the 50s and 60s was after the GI Bill. But before that, I think there was a time when universities were matchmaking services for the well-off.
Yeah. Yeah.
People would see like, oh, look, for some these people, yes, we're married, but we're lower middle class. We're still struggling. But you look at the people who had the degrees, and it seemed like those people went to college. You look at the high society women; those high society women went to college, but they went to college not necessarily to study certain things. The men might have studied specific things that were needed to the business and the field that the family already has that they're going to go into. Some women in a lesser extent did that, but they would meet and match up in university and have that solidity. And that, like as I mentioned before, somebody who's single has less of a drive or need to actually earn. But these people would come out married in these power couple relationships, enter these things, and then they would keep going up in society, keep with that strata. It's more of a more stronger caste system back then. And so people would see that, and I think people still carried that on without completely understanding what was really happening in colleges and universities because it was very shut off from the general public. And
Yeah.
then they think, oh, as long as you just go to college and university, you'll also find someone, you'll also get married, you'll also be successful. And it's not quite that anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we did a whole series on that, so I'm
Yeah.
not going to belabor that point too much. All right, I have let's see, 2 paragraphs left to read. They're both fairly long, but I
Oh,
think
there's one more thing before we get to this paragraph, and we'll try to
sure.
focus on the paragraph. So here it says, for a dimensional fulfillment, which can be created only in a struggle against the institutions. That is very key to what we see in the activist movement and the regressive social justice warrior
Yeah,
hashtag thing. People really do get a sense of fulfillment
yeah,
by feeling that they're part of this big struggle against this institution. That's why I think for some people it's this they truly feel like they're the hero of the story. They truly feel like they're going through their kind of historical type of thing, and that feels they feel that's where they feel like I can come and save the black man just by speaking. White silence is violence. So if I just say words, if I just give a hashtag out there, then all of a sudden I've empowered someone. They feel fulfilled about that, but it's like junk fulfillment. It's like junk food. I think it leaves them very empty at the end of the day because they realize it's not really something that they're actually doing. And then at that same point, it's one of the main things that keeps them from accepting that they are the institution. In a way, it's like now it's like, hey, now Joe Biden is in. Now you have like 50 senators. You don't have majority in the House. I think they still have they have majority in the House too. But yeah, so they're in control and they are the establishment. That's Hollywood is out there. These big companies are hashtagging the things that you're doing. You are the institutions. You are the establishment. You are the most educated that has the degrees
yeah,
and credentialized. So they want to seem like they're for the people, for the workers. But no, you are at the same point, they want to say we are the most educated, but oh, we're not the intelligence here. We're not the ones in control of these things. So that's I think that creates cognitive dissonance. That I think you see some of these people go through those things of feeling very high and then dropping down like, oh, it's tough.
Well, 2 points on those before we move on, because you just made me think of them. Benjamin Boyce was talking to a professor who also has done therapy, and he talked about this is the problem with the whole woke stuff infecting therapy, is that we talked about how in the coddling of the American mind, they argue that the social justice stuff has a reverse cognitive behavioral therapy effect because it teaches you to think in oversimplified ways. It teaches you to catastrophize. It teaches you to think that a group is the cause of all the problems, et cetera, et cetera. And well, the tragic thing is you're already taking people that usually have issues, hence why they're in therapy. Now, for some, as you say, it may give them a purpose in life, and that in and of itself can become fulfilling. But it's the whole pseudo reality thing of they just become entrenched in another echo chamber that they have to preserve, because if they break that, it just causes they have to confront reality, and that creates more dysfunction. So it's a really tough spot to be in. I don't think there's a quick fix here, but letting woke people take over therapy isn't the solution.
Yeah, there's some fields I think when you get to the very theoretical fields, the very already people will say like they understand like we are leaving reality, we're not involved in reality. When you get to like gaming, I think when you get to like entertainment, we're like this is fiction, this is us making up these rules and things like that. And then when you get to the opposite side of I think the bell curve and things like that, where it's very practical, structural things. Like this is 100% scientific in the sense like lab scientific testing and things like that. You really can't see critical theory and this kind of wokeness. It can't really cling on to those places because the people who are like creative are like, no, you're making up. This is entirely made up. You're making this up. This thing we're talking about is not going to adjust to your supposed ideas of how reality should be because we made it all up. We made it up because it's not reality. We made it up to be this way. So if you have an objection with this, create your own thing over there. So I think there's that part. And now on the other side of the structural things, they're like, no, 2 + 2 is 4. Because if we say it might be 5, and we say, okay, this thing should be able to weigh and carry this thing, that bridge will drop. So physics is physics. You can't bring wokeism into physics. Like it's just not going to accept. It's not going to match. And I think we're living in a society where it's already metastasized as much as possible in those things in the middle of the bell curve that now that you see it going to those outskirts. And for most people, it's like, oh, these things that we generally deal with, I don't care if Nike, who I occasionally buy shoes from, cares about wokeism. Because I'll still buy their shoes or I'll go buy these other shoes. But when it comes to like, I'm taking my free time to hang out and watch games and play games, no, I don't want you in there. When it's like I'm going to the doctor in order to get my actual like something fixed, I don't want this whole thing where like, oh, you're black, you have the same kind of system. I'm just going to give you blood from somebody else in this kind. That one's like, no, we're not equal. You have to actually deal with me as an individual. So I think that's the kind of thing that we start seeing.
Well, I hadn't thought about this till recently. I guess it should have been obvious to me now, but my friend Mikael commented on one of my James Lindsay critical race theory posts, and he made the comment how basically what it is the post says something about how it can't be discredited among those who accept it because any attempt to discredit it basically confirms it because they see any criticism as looking to preserve the status quo. Now, he said what Mikhail said. I hadn't thought about this. He goes, this is actually the mentality of a paranoid schizophrenic, because if you try to persuade them to seek help, they accuse you of either you're trying to imprison them or stop them from fighting whatever conspiracy they're fighting against. And I guess he knew of one paranoid schizophrenic. I don't think he knew the person directly, but he knew them like about them through other people, how they believed that they were protecting an artifact from transdimensional demons, and that if you tried to imprison them, you were either in the employ of the demons or you were a demon in disguise. But then it's like, how do you fight against that? Because if you try to help them, they think you're preventing them from doing that thing. And with the CRT crowd, it's the same thing. It's like, oh, if you question it or criticize it, well, you're just part of the status quo upholding the system, so you're an enemy who has to be silenced or destroyed. It's like, how do you fight against that?
So yeah, so I guess like eventually even paranoid schizophrenics will create groups where there's a chance of them having those accepted truths for them, even within themselves as an individual, there's going to be certain truths. It's not like constant fluctuation. Like there might be some who it's constantly fluctuating through things, but even a paranoid schizophrenic in general will have a sort of set of truths that they have in their mind that might not just be based on observation, but based on things that deal with their schizophrenia. That's interesting.
I thought it was interesting. It's like, you know, we talk about them having mental issues, but like that is an interesting parallel. Like the idea of any challenge to the ideology is seen as an assault on them and an attempt to work against them. So it's like, how do you, you know, reason with that?
And this is
Or
something I think
can
we've
can
talked
you?
about before. I think it was in the
Yeah.
Critical Theory series, where it's like you live in certain societies. Advanced civilizations have created places where we know if you're born and you don't have the ability to walk. If you live in an advanced modern society, you're going to make it to adulthood. You could reproduce. If you're blind, there's things that are, if you can't hear. However, in certain places, in the past, before these advancements, you would probably die in childbirth, not because people hated you, just because there was no actual ways to accommodate your life. You probably, if you would live, you would not be desirable enough to be able to earn enough to, if you're a male, to attract a partner, to, if you're a female, to be attractive enough for a male that is willing, that is able, because the percentage of people that actually married and reproduced in the past was far fewer than it has been right now in the more recent time when when monogamy and that one-on-one marriage is a thing that was based. So you had that kind of situation, but that's easier to see and accept. But we haven't. I don't think many people have accepted that. Also, mental handicaps and mental differences. Like if you're schizophrenic in a totalitarian society and you're not able to understand that there's certain truths that are allowed in the society that you can't go outside, you might not say like, "Oh no, I'm not going to follow Mao Zedong because he's doing something like he's actually going to like having these farmers with the things. You're not going to realize that, oh, we're going to accept this because if we don't accept this, they're going to kill us. You'll be adamant that no, the iron is actually being created by these pixies that are destroying us and things. So you'll start talking about that thing, and
Yeah.
you will get killed off. so
Yeah.
so I think in the past, because the West is actually a lot more compassionate, because we have more advanced civilizations, we created a situation where people with more, I don't want to say handicaps, but people with more diverse abilities and views of the world have been able to exist. And with some of these, it could just be like there's a higher number of schizophrenic people in the world that will be attracted to certain things.
Yeah.
And in the past, it was like the accepted religion. If you were schizophrenic and you happen to tie into that, you could be very successful within that field because you're super into it. But now there's way more religions, freedom of religion, that you can follow different kind of faith systems and things like that to increase that. Could be something to that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
All right.
But that's interesting with paranoid schizophrenics. I hadn't really thought of that. I thought it was more. I think the schizo idea. I thought it was all over the place, but I didn't know they could. It makes sense that they can develop an actual system that they stick to.
Yeah, and any attempt to falsify the system, any attempt to falsify their belief system is upholding the status quo and persecuting them. So
Yeah.
it's like, how do you? Yeah.
Huh.
All right. So I have two paragraphs here. All right. Today, the rupture with the linguistic universe of the establishment is more radical. In the most militant areas of protest, it amounts to a methodical, that's interesting, not methodological, reversal of meaning. It is a familiar phenomenon that subculture groups develop their own language, taking the harmless words of everyday communication out of their context and using them for designating objects or activities tabooed by the establishment. This is the hippie subculture, and that says in quotes, trip, grass, pot, acid, and so on. But a far more subversive universe of discourse announces itself in the language of black militants. Here is a systematic linguistic rebellion which smashes the ideological context in which the words are employed and defined and places them into the opposite context, negation of the established one. Thus, the blacks, quote unquote, take over some of the most sublime and sublimated concepts of Western civilization, desublimate them, and redefine them. For example, the soul, in its essence, lily white ever since Plato, the traditional seat of everything that is truly human and man, tender, deep, immortal, the word which has become embarrassing, corny, and false in the established universe of discourse has been desublimated in this transubstantiation, migrated to the Negro culture. They are soul brothers. The soul is black, violent, orgiastic. It is no longer in Beethoven, Schubert, but in the blues and jazz and rock and roll and soul food. Similarly, the militant slogan, Black is beautiful, redefines another central concept of the traditional culture by reversing its symbolic value and associating it with the anti-color of darkness, tabooed, magic, the uncanny. The ingression of the aesthetic into the political also appears at the other pole of the rebellion against the society of affluent capitalism among the nonconformist youth. Here, too, the reversal of meaning, driven to the point of open contradiction, giving flowers to the police, quote unquote, flower power, the redefinition and very negation of the sense of quote unquote power, the erotic belligerency of in the songs of protest, the sensuousness of long hair, of the body unsoiled by plastic cleanliness. Yeah. So some interesting stuff in there.
Yeah, there's some interesting. Like as I said before, I really like how Marcuse writes. I really like
Yeah.
his diction, his use of words. It's very excellent. Um, yeah, so where to start? There's a lot of things in here, like you said.
Yeah.
So they're talking about here. Just one thing that really that stuck out to me first was the whole this thing of it's a familiar phenomenon that subcultural groups develop their own languages, taking the harmless words of everyday communication out of their context and using it for their designating objects and activities tabooed by the establishment. Now, this is the thing. Like again, we talk about the perception of them as not the establishment, but regardless, even though they are the establishment almost always has been a subculture. Because like you look at British culture, we talked about history, and I said like history is really actually a story about like the names. Like you think when you pick out the major names in human history, people who you can say like that maybe a few 100,000 people today would know the name of this individual, and you look at across all cultures, it probably comes down to 1 million people tops. Like,
Yeah.
yes, you can't tell the history of the world without talking about World War II, where 19 million people died, I think it was. But you don't know the names of 19 million people. You know the names of like Ribbentrop, like Chamberlain, like Hitler, like you know Stalin. You know those people. So you know those are the kind of people, the names that you know. It's really just down to 1 million people. So that's always a subculture. Like the people that the powers that be are always a subculture. The establishment is always a subculture in and of itself. Despite this fact that people think the subculture is general population, it's no. The establishment is just what the general population accepts to have certain powers. It's always been that way. Even in authoritarian places, the most authoritarian place you can think of, the people need to accept. The people could have come up and tried to take down Mao, and eventually Mao ended, but people had to accept it before it. Like Mao wasn't, no establishment has literally been able to truly control people. I guess you can talk about due to religions and different things, but you still have to accept, though that family is our gods, you're accepting that as an established truth. So despite that, what I wanted to say was this: who is the group right now in culture taking words and changing the meaning of those words and using certain own language, where when somebody says something and you're like, when you say racist, do you mean this? No, that's not what racism means. It means this other thing. Okay, so if it means that, does it apply here? No, in that situation, it means something else. Who's doing that right now?
Yeah.
Who's doing that? Yeah.
All right. Let's see. What did I have here? So let's see. Subculture, the hippies, subversive. That makes sense. Sort of rebelling. Every generation has slang though, so I don't see that as a big deal. That was interesting though. He talks about the soul and the reference to Plato and talking about like the soul going from life to life, a world of forms, remembering things from previous lives and all this. And now soul in the context he's talking about with the black music, it's an expression of your spirit. Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. Soul food,
Cancel
soul.
this man.
And it almost again reminds me kind of the Nietzsche, the master versus slave morality. Like, okay, the police have guns, so we're going to put flowers in their guns and to sort of mock them and, but not use violence. And it kind of reminds me of that a little.
Yeah, that reminds me of the thing that the Pepsi did. And there's this thing like outreach marketing where they completely understand that some of the things is just getting the name out there. People have studied these things to understand how many interactions with a certain product do you need in order for you that to be something that pops into your mind. I think it's something like 27. I was listening to School Sucks podcast. There was somebody on talking about outreach marketing and how advertising agencies and companies and things completely understand. They're like, we know that 70% of our advertising actually works, but like 30% of it is going to be actually signaling to these other people, kind of paying a toll, paying the mafia, paying a nodding the head to these people that if we don't do this, eventually they'll find something. Like the Gillette thing, for example. I don't think anyone in the actual top level Gillette system actually thought that, hey, if we do this, we're going to crap on majority of the people that buy our stuff, they completely understand that you get that out there. Now, after that ad, there's going to be very little reason for people who don't buy Gillette to look at Gillette and be like, that is a pro-male type of thing. Let's boycott them. And most of the men who are using it might get pissed off for a bit during that time and stop using them, but they would still make really good product and they'll go back to it. So there's that kind of question where there's an aspect of that. But what I was talking about with this was Pepsi, when they had like Kendall Jenner during that protest movement type of time, go out and have that ad where they were at a protest and she showed up and there was like a police line and she gives them a Pepsi. And it's like, oh, Pepsi, like, it's like that commodification of it. That's what I'm saying. Like, you are the establishment now. The establishment, Pepsi, one of the biggest like companies in the world, is pushing your stuff, is pushing that kind of flower power thing that back then when Marcuse was writing this, the hippie subculture really was countercultural to majority of the things. And I guess in the same sense, the woke culture is still countercultural of majority of things, but the hippies did not have politicians giving them nods. They did not have vice presidents bailing them out of the protests when they were arrested by the cops. They did not have that happening. Yet you have the predominant subculture now is getting a nod from the people in positions of power.
Yeah, it was interesting too. Did you ever see The Butler?
No.
So it was with Forrest Whitaker. Oprah was in it. Basically, he plays the butler who was he was butler to all those various presidents. I think like from Eisenhower all the way to Reagan or something.
Oh,
and it's
cool.
sort of like it's told from his perspective, like he sees like how history is being made and like, you know, civil rights and of course Reagan, the Cold War, all this. And I thought it was interesting because they show with his son and his son's girlfriend sort of the whole Black Power thing, how when they start off earlier on, they're going to segregated schools, but like the girl has like her hair straightened out and down long and she's wearing like a schoolgirl outfit and stuff. But when they become in the Black Power stuff, like she has like a fro, hoop earrings, and he has like a militant outfit on. And it sort of illustrates that sort of rebelling against the dominant culture. Whereas back then you did have segregation, but it was like the segregated culture was sort of imitating the white culture, I guess you could say, in a way. Like you spoke a certain way, you dress a certain way, and then a lot of the Black Power stuff was rebelling against that, and that there were different themes, the African themes and all that. So I thought it was kind of interesting how that was expressed. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like could be a rather interesting film.
Yeah.
Like Oprah's a really good actress, and that's something that was really pointed out. Like people,
Forrest Whitaker is good too. I like him.
yeah, both of them are really good. I think one of my favorite roles of Forrest Whitaker was I was just saying, Last King of Scotland, where he played Idiot Ming.
That was very good. Yeah,
garbage human being, but he really did it. That film is one of those things where it's like you watch it, like the first time I watch it, like, oh, it's a really great film, but I'm never going to watch that again. I just never want to like get that imagery in my mind again. So
there were some other good actors too. Like I know, well, Robin Williams played Eisenhower. You know, it was towards the end of his life. Who was it? Alan Rickman played Reagan. I thought that was cool because Rickman's British, and yeah, there are a few other good actors too.
Yeah, and I think the people who are the best actors are the people who people don't really talk about that much. You know, like Tom Cruise is a rather accomplished actor, but people say a lot about Tom Cruise, about him, because he's a very good performer, and his whole thing is a performance. Like even in his regular life, he's a performer and things like that. But the really good actors are the ones you don't really talk too much about them, because outside of their acting, they're so different from, I think, their person. Like Daniel Day-Lewis doesn't really come up that often when you talk about a really good actor, because when he does the parts, he's those parts. Like most people don't really understand, like Oprah is a really accomplished actress, but when they see her on the Oprah show, they just like fall into that, but they don't get like that is also an act. Like if you hung out with Oprah in person, I doubt she's like that. Like she's probably, I don't know who she is like as an individual, but like she's really excellent at being Oprah. Like it's really excellent. She gets in that character. She makes you really buy it. But what I wanted to say with that, I think I wanted to say, talking about this culture here, this part. I have a video talking about Beethoven. It's like people say like, okay, Hitler and the Nazis, that's a German thing. That's owned by the Germans. It's specifically German. That's why Germans, white people, they need to have that kind of damnation for the rest of their life. But would they say that with like Beethoven? They say like Beethoven is inherently German. So like Ode to Joy, that's something that only Germans own. We should thank Germans from it, just like we should damn Germans for Hitler. And like, no, it's part of the human condition. And he writes this here. This would be, if a writer today wrote something like this, they would be canceled for this. This whole statement, it's no longer in Beethoven, Schubert, but in the blues and jazz and rock and roll and in soul food. what he's not getting here, that I'm not understanding why he's not getting, is Beethoven and Schubert were in an existence that was, Beethoven probably didn't know one black person. It's
No,
like
no,
he had never been to Africa. He'd never really heard
no.
probably other languages besides German, and it's like that was him getting to express a human observation that fit the life that he had. And the reason it's something that can be spoken to other people is he found a way to do it in a specific language. But the thing he was expressing was so it's transcended his lived experience. It was very close to something true rather than just a truth that they had, that it can transcend that. And that's the same thing with the soul. It's not like they said Beethoven isn't soulful. It's just that was not a language that they were speaking. And certain the blues and certain the jazz that they speak right there, that was something that really spoke to those people, had never heard German, who had never known Beethoven, never lived in that kind of situation. So they might have been expressing those same things. And there's some parts. And another difference here is when Beethoven and Schubert, they were people that are filtered through. When you talk about the field of classical music in general, especially the older ones, it's actually 8 to 10 composers. But
Yeah.
it doesn't mean there was only 8 to 10 composers. There was thousands of composers working at that time. But through history, it was filtered down to these people. So he's comparing Beethoven and Schubert, the best to the best, to blues and jazz that were brand new. So he was listening to people still testing it out. He wasn't listening to the he wasn't listening to the like if he heard the new kind of jazz equivalent of composers when they were starting out, they might not have spoken to him in the same kind of sense. So I think here it shows some kind of limitation in him trying to understand what people were trying to get at, and with different things, different experiences.
Well, I was going to say it's interesting too how most of the famous composers are either German or Austrian. I mean, off the top of my head, Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, Handel, Haydn, German, then Mozart was Austrian. Chopin was famous. He was actually French descent but lived in Poland. Well, there's Tchaikovsky. He was Russian. I'm trying to think. I mean, like how many? Like, there's a few that like are really famous, but like, I mean, like you say, there probably were a lot of people who composed. We just don't know about them.
Yeah. And
And
another thing here with the arts and the creation, especially with him being an artist, I think I'm wondering why he's not. I thought that might make him kind of understand some of these things a bit differently, but maybe he did, and he's writing it this way, and I'm misunderstanding him. But with something like with soul food, I'm trying to think like in the United States of America, part of why I'm saying black culture is separate. Black does not equal African. African Americans are not black, and blacks are not African Americans. Like they've developed something like soul food, and that's something that was developed more recently, where there's more a cuisine like that, a culinary tradition. And that's in part due to them living in a more advanced society after they got out of slavery, despite the struggles that they had. They had an ability to develop and focus on why we're doing this, get that more artistic aspect in the foods they have. Yet peoples that have been in Africa longer haven't really developed cuisine because their food is more just, we need to boil these beans and put these things together, and it's what we have, and we're doing it. They didn't get to the point where they had those people with that extra time to add that extra kind of artistic touch to it, where now you're just getting to the point where now you have certain cultures in Africa now developing like different cuisines and actual fields that are even close to matching something like soul food, let alone matching the older traditions of like the European forms of cuisine. So that's something that I'm kind of seeing where it's like, I see that happening with arts where there's some misconception with that. And maybe from my artistic background, I have it's one of the peccadillos, one of the things that kind of nags at me.
yeah, it's interesting too how jazz was actually forbidden in the Third Reich because
Really?
Negro jazz, yeah, wasn't allowed. And in the book, in the book Fatherland, that's when when Germany wins the war, they actually said that the Germans have perfected a jazz devoid of Negro influence. I'm like, I don't even know what that means, but
That's hilarious, man. Yeah. Oh, and so speaking about that, just one thing on the side, like I can imagine this kind of vitriol coming out. Like it was some time back. I was listening to I was this Old Town Road with Lil Nas X and Billy Ray Cyrus. Lil Nas X was a newer rapper, actually gay. It kind of matches the situation. Billy Ray Cyrus is really a much older guy. He was in country music. He's the father of Miley Cyrus and it's two other Cyrus, I think. Noah Cyrus and the male Cyrus is in like that. It's in this other group. If you remember that, there's a song like that. Metro Station, I think that was the group he was in. Well, anyway, he's more for country music, and they did a song, Little Old Town Road, that was really big. Really, I still listen to it. It's still a great song. And I was like, that did a lot more in bringing disparate cultures together than the last 50 years of racial relations, politics, trying to get people from more country kind of areas to get along with people in the urban areas. And that's what happens with the arts. And then Lil Nas X just recently partnered with Nike and is releasing some shoes, 666 pairs of the shoes with like a pentagram on it, and Ezekiel, some Bible verse written on it or something. And inside the shoe, in the part where there's only like air, there's like some kind of red liquid with like one drop of human blood in all the shoes, and there's some people are like, oh, this is crazy! I can't believe they're releasing this during the Easter. I'm like, this to me, that's the kind of artistic experience that I follow. I'm like, yes, I'd like that kind of challenging type of situation. But for some people, it's blasphemy. I'm wondering if how much of that undone of the good work that he did with Old Town Road. But yeah, I can see that consternation in the arts, and it's something that does happen.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
All right. I have one more paragraph left.
Okay,
It's probably good. All right. Let's see here. But today's rebels against the established culture also rebel against the beautiful in this culture, against its all too sublimated, segregated, orderly, harmonizing forms. Their libertarian aspirations appear as a negation of traditional culture, as a methodical desublimation. Perhaps its strongest impetus comes from social groups, which thus far have remained outside the entire realm of the higher culture, outside its affirmative, sublimating, and justifying magic. Human beings who have lived in the shadow of this culture, the victims of the power structure which has been the basis of this culture. They now oppose to the quote-unquote music of the spheres, which was the most sublime achievement of this culture, their own music, with all the defiance and all the hatred and the joy of rebellious victims defining their own humanity against the definitions of the masters. The black music invading the white culture is the terrifying realization of "Oh Freunde, nicht dies Tone," which means in German, "Oh friend, not these sounds." The refusal now hits the chorus, which sings "Ode to Joy," the song which is invalidated in the culture that sings it. Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus knows it. I want to revoke the Ninth Symphony. In the subversive, dissonant crying and shouting rhythm, born in the quote-unquote dark continent and in the quote-unquote deep south of slavery and deprivation, the oppressed revoke the Ninth Symphony and give art a desublimated, sensuous form of frightening immediacy, moving, electrifying the body and the soul, materializing the body. Black music is originally music of the oppressed, illuminating the extent to which the higher culture and its sublimations, sounds redundant, its beauty have been class-based. The affinity between black music and its avant-gardistic white development and the political rebellion against the quote-unquote affluent society bears witness to the increasing desublimation of culture. All right.
Okay. So in this, it seems like you could read this in one way where you've read the entire thing, so you can maybe fill me in on it. But is he coming from the point of view where he's saying this is actually an example of what I think should happen in order to break down some of the norms in society? He's not saying, like, he's not decrying that Ode to Joy is going away. He's just saying, like, look, this is what happens when people are questioning the established system. He's saying Ode to Joy is part of the establishment, so we kind of will, in order to have this change, we need to see, like, part of why most of society is seeing black music in this kind of sense that he's putting here is because it actually is something that is disrupting the establishment, but that's also, that disruption is something that he supports rather than he's against.
Yes, and let me differentiate here between the postmodernists and the critical theorists as well, because as we've discussed a few times, if you remember, the critical theorists being born out of Marxism are operating in a modernist framework, so they believe in objectivity, truth, and all this. Whereas the postmodernists completely threw that out. Lyotard especially. Lyotard was critical of all meta narratives, as they call them, whether it be Christianity, Marxism itself, all this. So Lyotard was just about basically, okay, all these uphold certain meta narratives. There is no truth. We should just all sort of find our own truth in the context of our times. All this, whereas Marcuse is saying we should sort of rebel against the current establishment and achieve liberation, which will lead us towards our ideal Marxist system. So
okay,
yeah. So
this is part of that.
Yeah, but notice, because remember, Marcuse gave up on sort of winning over the working class, so that's why he talked about winning over blacks, women, gays, all this.
Okay.
And he's saying we have to, like Adam Patrick said about fight on all fronts with all weapons. That's kind of what Marcuse was arguing here. Like, it's not, okay, we just have to tear down the system economically. We have to infiltrate the culture and all these other ideas. And that, quote unquote, black music was sort of working to do that. Like,
Okay, so
in this particular, yeah.
he's trying to tell people like don't be shocked or don't try to squash this. This is part of the new sensibilities, or this is
Yeah.
part of what will lead to a new sensibility by
Yeah.
destroying or by questioning and breaking down the old sensibilities.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And the first line here says, but today's rebels against the established culture also rebel against the beautiful in this culture, also against its all too sublimated, segregated, orderly, harmonizing forms. So yeah, I guess he's saying like, yeah, you personally like Ode to Joy, and you should, because Ode to Joy is beautiful, but understand why some of the rebels seem to be attacking what you consider beautiful, because some of those beautiful things are sublimated. They're saying, so he's saying, and he said that maybe before, that's why he's saying like, oh, to black people, the soul isn't Ode to Joy, isn't Beethoven, instead it's jazz. So he's saying, so maybe he was saying what I was saying, where to him he's saying like, this is kind of fits the same thing that what Beethoven does to you is what jazz and these people do to it. So maybe he's actually what I was saying. Maybe I was misreading in there.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, let me
Yeah.
see. I'm trying to. Do you have anything else to add? I was trying to think if there was any.
I don't know, the new opposing music sphere. So yeah, this is I guess where it's going through, where he's just saying the refusal now hits the chorus and sings out joy. No, I think that's it. So yeah, maybe he was saying that, and like that's what I'm saying. Like as I've said, a lot of things in here, I rather agree with him. There's some things I don't really understand, and they put in the wrong way. And I think that's something that happens when you engage with reality. Some things you don't necessarily understand, and you can adjust and change your mind when you get new information.
My one thing, and I think I mentioned this before, but it bears worth restating, especially in this, is I do reject overall though this Marxist framework of this is high culture, this is low culture. Like Adorno, remember, wrote entire reams criticizing jazz music, and the idea that popular music is bad because it's created by the bourgeoisie to keep the lower people in line. My thing is, I don't think there should be higher or lower music, because like I said, a lot of these rappers come from poverty but end up millionaires by the ends of their life. And Danielle Ballou, who I used to work for, he talks about having prominent rappers come to Danielle and eat. And it's like, these are people from poor urban areas who became millionaires and they're eating in one of the top restaurants. But would you say that's high or low culture? I don't think it should be designated one or the other. Or, our vice president saying I twerk to Cardi B. It's like, is that high or low culture now? It's like, yeah, like how do you, to me, I don't think there should be a classification either way. I get that in the 1950s, I mean, this was the 60s, but 50s especially, things were very conformist. It was, okay, this is the dominant culture, and maybe you have at the fringes other cultures, but I don't think there should be a one dominant culture. It should be people embrace what they see are good ideas, bad ideas get thrown out. It shouldn't be you have to be one or the other.
That's something that we've discussed before, where now when people talk about the gaps, like they talk about the floor has always been the floor. But at the same point in the past, like when it was classical music, there was no recordings of classical music. In order for you to hear classical music, you had to have the ability to access or have an entire orchestra. So that's getting the actual instruments, having the location, having the time to actually go there and sit. So how many people during that time were actually able to listen to that? But now, if you're just some quote unquote poor person not making a living wage, you can listen to a recording of Ode to Joy just in the same way as Elon Musk can, as Jeff Bezos. So they might have other things, they might have access to many more things because the ceiling has raised a lot higher. But in general, most of the people at that bottom level are as close for the basic type of things. Like a basic thing is this enjoyment of the arts. In general, your average human today in a Western world has a lot more access to the basic levels of arts and extras and things than they did in the past. Like the number of people that could actually see a Van Gogh in the past, or the equivalent of Van Gogh in the past, was only the family that owned the Van Gogh and the few people that were passing it around that would go to that house. But now, if you find your way to the Met, if you just find your way to New York, you can go in there for free and see that. So, or not even just that, you can go online, you can get a print, you can see the actual thing. Because yeah, it's different when you see it in person versus when you see a print, but it's access, and that's with the arts. Now, when it comes to the actual basic information of the practical things in the day-to-day life that can improve your life and make you actually be able to earn and be able to be more useful to yourself and other people around you, there's very many means to do that rather than just accessing the school. It's not simply just going to that education system that we've discussed that used to be just pretty much a situation to meet a wife for the wealthy people and have somebody trained to take on the business that their parents were already in. So people have that false idea where it's like, no, you can come online, you can get this information, you can answer these questions. These known unknowns that I was talking about before are, you're living in an unprecedented time where you can actually get those things to be known. If you have a feeling, if you think a certain way and you feel there's nobody present physically around you that is in that same kind of mindset, you can reach out online and be parts of different communities without having to physically be limited by your physical location and time and things like that. So those are the kind of things that I'm thinking are just an amazing time to be alive, where you don't have to say, I only have jazz music, but you have a situation where somebody can go in and learn and grow up in a ghetto with just jazz music, but then they grow up and they're able to understand and value and see the why Ode to Joy is in there. They don't have to have the situation where you're antagonistic. It's not one or the other. There's ways for people on both sides to understand what these different people were trying to get at with that creation. So I think that's a positive time to be alive. Yeah.
I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I used to know someone who worked at Hard Rock Cafe, and they said that was one of the things that was a big deal there, was that it was one of those places where both average people and celebrities came in and would sort of sit side by side. Like it used to be, if you had money, you ate in the nice places, you were poor, you ate in the other places, but it became much more differentiated because even people with money, they're not going to eat at Dan Yellen per se every day. It's not just the cost of money. It's sitting down for hours, eating all that food. It's like, even if you have money, you're not going to do that every day. But then it's like, if you're middle class or like, moderately well off, you do it once in a while. If you have money, you may do it once a month maybe or something, but it's like, you're still going to eat in ordinary places. So that those lines blurred a lot, which I think is a good thing in many respects.
Yeah. I think that's it for me.
Yeah. All right. That's all I have for this section. So.
Okay, great. So that's been the new Sensibilities. And then we'll get back to you on, I think we'll record tomorrow, Stephen, or the next couple of days. I haven't even posted the first part yet, but I think tomorrow I will get the first part post-produced and then get that up probably tomorrow, which is, we're recording this on Monday, the 28th, I think.
29th.
The 29th, yeah. The first part will be up tomorrow, which is the 30th, latest 31st, and then probably 3 days between the postings and others. But we will record in the next couple of days, Subverting Forces in Transition. As I mentioned, it's below, so you can read the other parts that we had skipped over in some of these, and these other things. Might be other things of interest. It might be things we mentioned that you think were not quite right. We'll be welcome to have you point those out in the comment section, wherever you might be listening to this at. Anything else to say to the people, Stephen?
Nope, that's all I have.
Okay, so that's it for me too. Till next time, thank you all very much for coming here and spending your time listening to this with us. As you mentioned, some of this content is long, but I think we're making this for a specific set of people. If your time is different, you can listen to it in sections. There will be different clips and things coming out. If you've enjoyed this and you haven't seen a lot of other content we have at least 5 different other series where we go into these longer conversations about things, some of them we mentioned. So that's it for me. Stephen, stay on for a little bit after we say goodbye, but goodbye.
Goodbye, thank you.